She traveled 2,000 miles with nothing but hope and a promise, only to be discarded like damaged goods before she could even set foot in town. What happened next would change not only her destiny, but the fate of an entire community. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Silverton train whistle pierced the mountain air with a shrill announcement of new arrivals. April 1886. The platform bustled with the usual crowd. Miners in dirt-stained clothes, merchants awaiting supplies, and a handful of ladies from town who treated each train's arrival as the day's entertainment. Among them stood Richard Hargrove, owner of the Silver Peak mine, dressed impeccably in a tailored suit that set him apart from the working men who labored beneath the mountains for his profit. Richard checked his pocket watch for the third time, his impatience evident in the tapping of his polished boot against the wooden platform. The train from Denver was 17 minutes late. 17 minutes of his valuable time wasted waiting for a woman he'd never met. "You sure about this mail-order business, Mr. Hargrove?" asked Joshua Palmer, the young reporter from the Silverton Gazette, who seemed to materialize wherever news might break. "Plenty of eligible ladies right here in town." Richard offered a tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "None with the proper background or refinement, Palmer. A man in my position requires certain standards." The train's brakes screeched as it finally rolled to a stop, belching steam that momentarily obscured the platform. Doors opened and passengers began to descend. First the businessmen, then families, and finally a slender figure in a navy blue traveling dress that had seen better days. Emma Wilson paused at the top of the steps, one gloved hand clutching a worn leather satchel, the other holding a letter. Her chestnut hair was pinned neatly beneath a modest hat, and despite the exhaustion evident in the shadows beneath her eyes, she carried herself with undeniable dignity. She surveyed the crowded platform, searching for the man whose elegant handwriting had painted promises of a respectable life far from the poverty that had haunted her in Boston since her father's death. The letter had been specific. "I will be wearing a black suit with silver cufflinks, standing near the station office." And there he was, tall, broad-shouldered, with a neatly trimmed beard and the confident posture of a man accustomed to authority. Emma took a deep breath, smoothed her travel-wrinkled skirt, and descended the steps. Richard Hargrove watched her approach with growing dismay. The photograph she had sent had suggested a certain delicacy that might, with proper attire and instruction, be molded into a suitable wife for a man of his standing. But the woman walking toward him moved with the practical stride of someone accustomed to work, not the demure step of a proper lady. Her clothes, while clean and modest, showed signs of mending, and her complexion bore the slight tan of someone who spent time outdoors rather than preserving the fashionable pallor of high society. "Mr. Hargrove?" Emma extended her hand, her voice clear and steady. "I'm Emma Wilson. Your letters have made me feel as though I know you already." Richard took her hand briefly, his expression cooling. "Miss Wilson, I trust your journey was adequate." "It was long but uneventful." Emma smiled, trying to ignore the sinking feeling in her stomach as she recognized the disappointment in his eyes. "I'm eager to see Silverton. Your descriptions made it sound like a place of opportunity and growth." "Yes, well?" Richard cleared his throat, looking past her to the baggage car. "Is that all you've brought?" He nodded toward her satchel. "I have one trunk being unloaded. It contains my books and some medical supplies. My father was a doctor, you see, and I assisted him for many years before his passing." Richard's frown deepened. "Medical supplies. I wasn't aware you had such unusual interests. In your letters, you emphasized your skills in household management and social graces." "I did, and I have those as well." Emma's spine straightened almost imperceptibly. But I thought my nursing knowledge might be of value in a mining town. Behind Richard, a murmur rippled through the small crowd of onlookers who had gathered to witness the meeting. Among them, a tall man in a worn but clean work shirt stood, slightly apart, his attention caught not by the spectacle of Richard meeting his mail-order bride, but by the quiet strength in Emma's bearing as she faced what was clearly becoming an uncomfortable situation. Thomas Sullivan, foreman of the Silver Peak mine, hadn't intended to be at the station that day. He'd come to collect a shipment of new safety lamps he'd ordered from Denver, an expense from his own pocket that Richard Hargrove had deemed unnecessary coddling of the miners. Now he found himself unable to look away from the unfolding scene. "Perhaps we should discuss this somewhere more private," Emma suggested, acutely aware of the curious eyes upon them. Richard made no move to lead her away from the platform. Instead, his gaze drifted past her to where Isabelle Montgomery, the banker's daughter, had just stepped onto the platform from her father's carriage. She wore a pale pink gown that likely cost more than Emma earned in a year as a teacher's assistant, and her golden hair gleamed in the afternoon sun. "Miss Wilson," Richard said, his voice lowered, but still audible to those nearest them, "I believe there has been a misunderstanding." Emma's hands tightened around her satchel. "What sort of misunderstanding, Mr. Hargrove?" "The kind that is best addressed quickly rather than prolonged." He straightened his already impeccable jacket. "You presented yourself in your letters as a woman of certain qualities and background. I find the reality somewhat different from my expectations." A hot flush crept up Emma's neck, but her voice remained steady. "I was entirely truthful in my correspondence, Mr. Hargrove. Perhaps your expectations were based on assumptions rather than my words." Richard's jaw tightened. "Nevertheless, I don't believe you would find Silverton to your liking. The mining business requires a certain type of wife, someone who understands social obligations and can help cultivate the right connections. Your practical skills, while perhaps admirable in their way, are not what I require in a partner." The words struck like precisely aimed arrows, designed to wound while maintaining the appearance of civilized discourse. Emma felt the weight of public humiliation pressing down on her shoulders, made heavier by the knowledge that she had spent her last savings on the train ticket west. "I see." Emma's voice was quiet but clear. "Then it seems I have traveled a very long way based on a promise made in haste. The next train east leaves tomorrow morning," Richard said, already beginning to turn away. "I'll arrange for your ticket and accommodations for the night at the boarding house." "That won't be necessary." Emma's words stopped him. "I came west to build a new life, Mr. Hargrove, not to retreat at the first disappointment. If you'll excuse me, I need to collect my trunk." Richard frowned, clearly expecting tears or pleading, rather than this composed rejection of his dismissal. Before he could respond, Isabelle Montgomery glided to his side, her smile dazzling, but her eyes sharp with assessment as they raked over Emma. "Richard, darling, is this your correspondence friend?" Isabelle's voice dripped with honey-coated disdain. "A misunderstanding, nothing more," Richard replied, his entire demeanor transforming as he turned to Isabelle. "Miss Wilson was just making other arrangements." "How unfortunate for her to have come all this way," Isabelle said, without a trace of genuine sympathy. She slipped her arm through Richard's with practiced ease. "Though I'm sure Boston will welcome her return." Emma turned away from them, dignity wrapped around her like armor, and moved toward the baggage car where the porter was unloading trunks and crates. She blinked rapidly, refusing to let tears fall while still within view of the whispering crowd. A deep voice spoke from beside her. "Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." "The porter's already left with the smaller bags. May I help you locate your trunk, miss?" Emma turned to find herself looking up at the tall man she had noticed earlier, broad-shouldered from physical labor rather than tailored padding, with eyes the color of the Colorado sky and a face weathered by outdoor work. "That's very kind of you, Mr. Sullivan. Thomas Sullivan. I'm the foreman at Silver Peak." He offered a small, respectful nod. "And you must be Miss Wilson." "Word travels quickly," Emma said with a wry smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Small towns run on gossip faster than the mines run on dynamite." Thomas's expression conveyed an apology for the public nature of her humiliation. "Is that your trunk there? The one with the brass corners?" Emma nodded, and Thomas effortlessly lifted the heavy trunk that contained her few possessions, medical books and her father's instruments. "Have you decided where you'll be staying?" he asked, his tone carefully neutral. "No." Emma's practical nature reasserted itself. "I don't suppose Silverton has much need for a teacher with nursing training?" Thomas paused, studying her with new interest. "Nursing training? My father was a doctor in Boston. I assisted him for years." She straightened her shoulders. "I'm also qualified to teach reading, writing, mathematics, and basic sciences." A thoughtful expression crossed Thomas's face. "The mining camp has 30 children with no formal schooling, and the closest doctor is in Durango, a full day's ride in good weather." Emma felt the first flicker of real hope since stepping off the train. "Are you suggesting there might be a place for me here after all, Mr. Sullivan?" "I'm suggesting, Miss Wilson, that Richard Hargrove's disappointment might be Silverton's good fortune." Thomas shifted the trunk to get a better grip. "Mrs. Palmer runs the boarding house on Pine Street. She's a fair woman who doesn't hold with gossip. She might know of work for someone with your skills." As they walked away from the station, Emma could feel the stares of the townspeople following them. She kept her chin high, though inside she was calculating how long her meager savings would last if work didn't materialize quickly. "Mr. Sullivan," she said after they had walked a block in companionable silence, "I appreciate your kindness, but I wouldn't want to cause difficulties between you and your employer." Thomas's laugh held more irony than humor. "Miss Wilson, Richard Hargrove and I have fundamental disagreements about almost everything except the fact that silver lies beneath these mountains. One more won't signify." "What sort of disagreements?" Emma found herself genuinely curious about this man, who seemed so different from what she had expected to find in a mining town. Thomas glanced at her, as if measuring how much to share with a stranger. "Hargrove sees the miners as tools to extract wealth from the earth. I see them as men with families who deserve safety and fair treatment." He shifted the heavy trunk. "Again, he builds mansions while they live in shacks. He hosts parties for Eastern investors while they die of lung sickness with no medical care." The passion in his voice resonated with Emma, reminding her of her father, who had often treated poor patients for free, much to her mother's dismay. "That's why you were at the station," she realized. Not to see me arrive, but for something else." "Safety lamps," Thomas confirmed. "The new Davy design that reduces the risk of explosions from coal dust." Hargrove refused to buy them, said the expense wasn't justified. So I ordered a dozen with my own savings. They had reached a 2-story wooden building with a wide porch and window boxes filled with early spring flowers. A hand-painted sign identified it as Palmer Boarding House. Clean rooms, fair rates. "Mrs. Palmer is the widow of a miner," Thomas explained as he set down the trunk to open the door. "She understands what it means to start over with nothing but determination." The door opened before he could reach for it, revealing a stout woman with silver-streaked dark hair and shrewd eyes that took in Emma's travel-worn appearance and Thomas's presence with a single glance. "So, the rumors flying up from the station were true," she said without preamble. "Hargrove showed his true colors, did he?" "Mrs. Palmer, this is Miss Emma Wilson," Thomas said. "She's looking for lodging and possibly work suited to her skills as a teacher and nurse." Martha Palmer's eyebrows rose. "A nurse, you say? Well, that's worth more than being Mrs. Richard Hargrove any day of the week." She stepped back, gesturing them inside. "Come in, Miss Wilson. Any woman who can hold her head high after what you just endured is welcome under my roof." Emma stepped into the warm, clean entry hall, feeling the first real welcome since her arrival in Silverton. "Thank you, Mrs. Palmer. I can pay for a week's lodging in advance, and I hope to find employment quickly." "We'll sort all that out over tea," Martha said firmly. "You look dead on your feet after that train journey, and doubtless in need of something stronger than tea after dealing with Hargrove, though I don't serve spirits in my establishment." Thomas brought the trunk inside. "I should get back to the mine for the evening shift change, but I wanted to make sure Miss Wilson was settled." Emma turned to him, extending her hand. "Thank you, Mr. Sullivan. Your kindness to a stranger won't be forgotten." Thomas took her hand briefly, his calloused palm warm against her gloved fingers. "Silverton isn't always welcoming to newcomers, Miss Wilson, but there are good people here. I hope you'll give us a chance to prove that." After he left, Martha Palmer led Emma to a small but clean room on the second floor with a window overlooking the mountains. "Rest a bit, then come down for tea. My son Joshua will be home soon. He works at the newspaper and knows all the town's business. If there's work to be had that would suit you, he'll know of it." Left alone, Emma finally allowed herself a moment of weakness. She sank onto the narrow bed and pressed her hands against her eyes, holding back the tears that threatened. She had gambled everything on Richard Hargrove's promises, and now she was stranded in a strange town with limited funds and no certainty of a future. But as the golden afternoon light spilled through the simple muslin curtains, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air, Emma felt something unexpected stir within her chest. Not despair, but possibility. Richard Hargrove had rejected her, yes, but in doing so, perhaps he had saved her from a greater disappointment that would have come more slowly, more painfully, over years rather than minutes. She rose and moved to the small washstand, pouring water from the pitcher into the basin. As she washed away the dust of travel, she made a decision. This would be a new beginning, not an ending. Silverton might not have given her the welcome she had expected, but it had offered her something potentially more valuable: the freedom to forge her own path, rather than stepping into a role prescribed by someone else. By the time she descended the stairs to join Mrs. Palmer for tea, Emma Wilson had already begun to reimagine her future, one built not on a wealthy man's approval, but on her own skills and determination. And somewhere in the back of her mind, the image of Thomas Sullivan's steady gaze and genuine concern lingered like a promise of unexpected allies in this new world she had entered. In the corner of the boarding house parlor stood a small upright piano, its wood darkened with age, but its brass candle holders polished to a warm glow. Emma's fingers itched to touch the keys, to see if music might still be coaxed from its strings. It had been one of her few indulgences in Boston, playing for the children she taught, finding solace in melody when words failed. "Do you play?" Mrs. Palmer asked, noticing Emma's gaze. "I do, though I'm out of practice. My mother insisted on lessons when I was young." "Then you must play for us sometime. That piano was my Henry's pride. Bought it for me on our 10th anniversary. Been sitting mostly silent since he died in the cave-in 3 years back." Emma heard the grief, still fresh in the older woman's voice. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Palmer." "Martha, please." She waved away the formality with a practical hand. "And don't waste sorrow on old wounds. This town's seen its share of widows. That's why I opened this place, to give myself purpose and other women shelter when the mines take their men." The front door opened, and a young man of perhaps 25 entered, removing his hat to reveal hair the same rich brown as Martha's must have been before silver threaded through it. Joshua Palmer had his mother's shrewd eyes, though his lanky frame suggested he took after his father. "Ma, is it true what they're saying down at the Gazette office?" Hargrove rejected his mail order. He stopped abruptly upon seeing Emma, his face flushing with embarrassment. "Beg pardon, ma'am. I didn't realize we had company." "Joshua Palmer, mind your manners," Martha scolded. "This is Miss Emma Wilson, our newest lodger. Miss Wilson, my son Joshua, who clearly needs remedial lessons in tact." "Please don't apologize," Emma said. "I'd rather honest awkwardness than whispers behind my back. And yes, Mr. Palmer, the rumors are true. Mr. Hargrove found me unsuitable." Upon arrival, Joshua's embarrassment gave way to indignation. "That's downright shameful behavior. A gentleman doesn't invite a lady across the country only to—" "A gentleman wouldn't," Martha interrupted dryly. "But we're talking about Richard." "Hargrove, now sit down and have some tea while Miss Wilson tells us what sort of work she might be looking for." Over the simple but satisfying meal of fresh bread, preserves and hearty stew, Emma shared more of her background, her father's medical practice, her own teaching experience, her hopes in coming west. Joshua listened intently, occasionally, jotting notes in a small notebook he produced from his pocket. When Emma inquired about it, he smiled sheepishly. "Occupational habit. I'm not just the typesetter at the Gazette. I write pieces sometimes too, human interest stories mostly." "My story is hardly of interest," Emma demurred. "I disagree," Joshua said with unexpected passion. "A woman of education and medical training choosing to remain in a mining town after rejection rather than return east. That's precisely the kind of story people should read." "Joshua," his mother warned, "Miss Wilson isn't here to be made into one of your tales." Emma considered for a moment. "Actually, if it might help me find work, perhaps a small mention wouldn't be amiss, though I'd prefer the focus remain on my qualifications rather than this afternoon's events." Joshua's face lit up. "I could write about the need for education and basic medical care in the mining camps. Hargrove wouldn't be mentioned by name, but everyone would know it was him who turned away someone the community desperately needs." Martha snorted. "Now you're thinking like a newsman. Nothing sells papers like making the rich look foolish." As they discussed possibilities, a knock came at the door. Martha rose to answer it, returning moments later with Thomas Sullivan, his hat in his hands and a determined expression on his face. "Mr. Sullivan," Emma said, surprised. "I didn't expect to see you again so soon, Miss Wilson." He nodded politely to her, then to Martha and Joshua. "I've had an idea I wanted to discuss with you, if you're not too tired from your journey." Martha gestured to an empty chair. "Join us, Thomas. Miss Wilson was just telling us about her skills." Thomas sat, declining the offered tea with a shake of his head. "I've spoken with some of the miners' wives. They've agreed to pool resources to hire Miss Wilson to teach their children 3 days a week and provide basic medical care as needed." Emma's eyes widened. "So quickly?" "Word travels fast when it's needed," Thomas said simply. "There are 37 children in the mining camp who've had no schooling since they arrived. And last winter we lost 3 people to fevers that might have been treated with proper medical knowledge. The pay wouldn't be much," he continued, "but they could offer housing. The old assayer's office has a living space above it that's been sitting empty. It would need cleaning, but it's sturdy and has a separate entrance that could serve as a small classroom and examination room." Hope fluttered in Emma's chest, but practicality made her cautious. "That's incredibly generous, Mr. Sullivan, but I must ask, won't this create problems with Mr. Hargrove? I wouldn't want to bring trouble to people who are already struggling." Thomas's jaw tightened. Hargrove owns the mine, not the town. The assayer's office belongs to the Miners' Association. What we do with it is our business. Joshua leaned forward, excitement in his eyes. This is perfect. Rejected bride becomes community healer. I can already see the headline. Joshua! His mother scolded, but Emma surprised them all by laughing, the first genuine laugh since she'd stepped off the train. Mr. Palmer, I fear you'll make me sound like something from a dime novel. Her eyes met Thomas's, and she found unexpected warmth there. But if the offer is genuine, Mr. Sullivan, I would be honored to accept it. Teaching and healing are far better uses of my skills than being an ornament in someone's parlor. Thomas smiled, a slow transformation that softened the lines of his weathered face. Good. I'll let everyone know, and we can start getting the place ready tomorrow, if that suits you. As they discussed details, Emma felt the weight of rejection lifting from her shoulders. Richard Hargrove's dismissal, meant to diminish her, had instead opened a door to purpose she might never have found as his wife. Later, as the evening shadows lengthened, Emma stood by the boarding house window, watching the lights of the mining camp flicker to life on the mountainside. Tomorrow would bring challenges, certainly, but also possibility. Behind her, Martha played a simple tune on the piano, the notes sweet and clear in the quiet room. You know, Martha said, pausing in her playing, in all my years in mining towns, I've seen how they test a person's true character. Some, like Hargrove, become odder greedier. Others, like Thomas Sullivan, become more determined to find humanity in harsh places. Emma turned from the window. And which was your husband? Martha's smile held both sorrow and pride. Henry was like Thomas, always fighting for better conditions, always putting others first. It's what killed him in the end. There was a collapse, and he went back for two young miners trapped behind a fall of rock. Her fingers rested silently on the piano keys. Thomas was the one who carried his body out. I'm so sorry, Emma whispered. I'm telling you this not for sympathy, but so you understand what kind of man offered you help today. Martha's gaze was direct. In places like Silverton, you learn quickly who can be trusted when the earth starts to shake. As Emma prepared for bed that night, her mind filled with plans for lessons and a mental inventory of her medical supplies, she realized that for the first time since her father's death, she felt a sense of genuine purpose. Richard Hargrove's rejection, meant as an ending, had instead become a beginning, not just for her, but potentially for an entire community in need of the skills she brought with her. And if, as she drifted towards sleep, her thoughts lingered on Thomas Sullivan's steady gaze and the quiet strength in his voice when he spoke of the miners' welfare, well, that was simply gratitude for his kindness, nothing more. Tomorrow would be soon enough to begin building her new life, one small, determined step at a time. The morning dawned clear and cold, the kind of spring day in the mountains when sunlight promised warmth, but the air still held winter's bite. Emma woke early, her body still attuned to Eastern time, despite the exhaustion of her journey. For a disorienting moment, she couldn't place the unfamiliar ceiling above her, the firm mattress beneath her back, the distant sounds of a town stirring to life that were nothing like Boston's crowded streets. Then memory returned. The train, platform, Richard Hargrove's cold dismissal, Thomas Sullivan's unexpected kindness, the boarding house with its piano in the corner. She sat up, pushing back the quilt Martha Palmer had provided, and moved to the small window. Silverton lay spread before her, a patchwork of wooden buildings nestled in a valley surrounded by mountains still draped in snow. In the distance, she could see the head frame of the Silver Peak mine silhouetted against the brightening sky, and closer, the bustle of miners heading to the morning shift. It was a raw, unfinished place compared to Boston's cultivated elegance, but something about its honest utility appealed to her. There was no pretense here, no generations of social hierarchy to navigate. There was only the work at hand and the people who did it. Emma dressed quickly in her most practical skirt and shirtwaist, securing her hair in a simple knot at the nape of her neck. Her trunk remained unopened from the night before, and now she unlocked it, lifting the lid to reveal her few possessions. On top lay her father's medical bag, the leather cracked but well-oiled, the brass clasp polished from years of use. Beneath it were his books, Gray's Anatomy, Materia Medica, surgical manuals, and texts on common ailments. These represented not just knowledge, but her inheritance, the only things of value she'd been able to keep after settling his debts. She closed the trunk, deciding to unpack later. First, she needed to see the space Thomas had described to determine if it could truly serve as both classroom and clinic. And if it could, what supplies would be needed immediately. Martha Palmer was already in the kitchen when Emma descended, kneading dough with strong, practiced movements. The scent of coffee filled the warm room, and a pot of porridge simmered on the stove. "Good morning," Emma said, suddenly conscious of being an unexpected addition to the household routine. Martha looked up, flour dusting her forearms. "You're an early riser. That'll serve you well out here. Most folks in mining towns start before the sun and work till it's long gone." She gestured to the stove with her elbow. "Help yourself too. Coffee and porridge. Thomas will be by in half an hour to show you the assayer's office." "You've already heard from him this morning?" Martha's laugh was warm and knowing. "Didn't need to. Thomas Sullivan's been the most reliable man in Silverton since the day he arrived. Says he'll do something, he does it. And usually earlier than expected." As if summoned by her words, a knock sounded at the kitchen door. Martha raised an eyebrow. "What did I tell you? Even earlier than I thought." She wiped her hands on her apron and opened the door to reveal Thomas, hat in hand, looking slightly abashed at his early arrival. "Mrs. Palmer, Miss Wilson, hope I'm not disturbing your breakfast." "Not at all," Emma said, rising from the table. "I was eager to see the space you mentioned." Thomas's gaze took in her practical attire with what seemed like approval. "It's a fair walk to the assayer's office, and the morning's still got a bite to it. Do you have a heavier coat?" "My traveling coat should suffice," Emma replied, retrieving it from the hook by the door. "I'm hardier than I might appear, Mr. Sullivan." Something that might have been a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "I'm beginning to see that, Miss Wilson." Martha pressed a cloth-wrapped bundle into Emma's hands. "Biscuits and cheese. You'll need more than coffee once you start working." The simple kindness caught Emma off guard, reminding her of her mother's similar gestures before illness had taken her years ago. "Thank you, Mrs. Palmer." Outside, Silverton was fully awake now, the main street busy with wagons delivering goods, shopkeepers opening for the day, and miners heading toward the trails that led up to various claims in the surrounding mountains. Several people nodded to Thomas as they passed, and a few curious glances were directed at Emma, but there was none of the open, staring or whispered gossip she had feared after yesterday's public rejection. "Word travels fast," Thomas explained, noting her surprise at the relative lack of attention. "By now, everyone knows who you are and what happened at the station, but they also know you're teaching the miners' children and providing medical care. That counts for more than gossip, in a place where both are sorely needed." They walked beyond the main business district to where smaller, rougher buildings housed the practical necessities of a mining town. The assay office where ore samples were tested, storage sheds for equipment, stables for the mules that hauled. Or carts. The buildings here showed more wear, their boards weathered to a silver grey, roofs patched in places. Thomas stopped before a two-story structure set slightly apart from the others. Its lower level featured a large front window, dusty but intact, with peeling gold letters that read Silverton Assay Office. A separate door to the right led to an exterior staircase that climbed to the second floor. The assayer moved to a bigger office closer to the railroad last year, Thomas explained. This place has been sitting empty, but the Miners' Association kept up the lease, thinking it might be needed someday. The ground floor has the old assay office, a big open room with counters that could serve as desks and plenty of light from that front window. The upstairs was the assayer's living quarters, 2 rooms and a small kitchen area with a pump for water. He produced a key from his pocket and unlocked the front door, which opened with a protesting creak. Dust motes danced in the sunlight that streamed through the dirty window, illuminating a large room with high ceilings. Along one wall ran a counter with cabinets above and below, once used for storing chemicals and equipment for testing ore samples. The opposite wall held built-in shelves, and the back of the room featured a large stone fireplace. Emma walked the perimeter, her mind already calculating the possibilities. The counter could serve as a work area for the older students, and the younger ones could use the floor space with slates. The shelves could hold books and medical supplies. She turned to Thomas. It will need a thorough cleaning, and proper desks would be ideal, but it could certainly work as a classroom. Thomas nodded, pleased by her practical assessment. The miners have basic carpentry skills. They could build simple desks and benches, perhaps not fancy, but sturdy. Sturdy is far more important than fancy, Emma said firmly. And what of the upstairs? You mentioned it could serve as living quarters? He led her back outside and up the exterior staircase to a door that opened directly into a modest living space. Unlike the lower level, this room showed signs of recent attention. The wooden floor had been swept, the small cast iron stove in the corner cleaned of dust, and a stack of firewood laid nearby. We sent a couple of the women up yesterday evening to make it presentable, Thomas explained, a hint of embarrassment in his voice. It's still sparse, but it's perfect, Emma interrupted, genuinely touched by the gesture. She moved to the single window, which offered a view of the mountains rising behind the town. All it needs is some proper cleaning and a few personal touches. A door to the right led to a smaller bedroom just large enough for a bed, small dresser, and washstand. The kitchen area consisted of the stove, a dry sink with a pump handle, and shelves for storing provisions. It was simple, utilitarian, and entirely her own. More independence than she had experienced since her parents' deaths had forced her to take boarders in their Boston home to make ends meet. What do you think, Miss Wilson? Will it serve? Emma turned to find Thomas watching her with an expression that seemed to hold more than casual interest in her answer. For the first time, she truly looked at him, not just as the kind man who had helped her when Hargrove rejected her, but as a person in his own right. The morning light revealed details she had missed yesterday, the faint scar that ran along his jawline, the crinkles at the corners of his eyes that spoke of smiling despite hard circumstances, the capable hands that belonged to someone who built rather than merely ordered others to build. It will more than serve, Mr. Sullivan. It will be a home and a place of purpose. I'm grateful for the opportunity. Relief washed over his features. The miners' wives will be by later today to help with the cleaning. Most of them work in the boarding houses or laundries in town, but they've arranged to take turns helping. You get settled. That's very kind, but I wouldn't want to impose. It's not an imposition, Thomas said firmly. You're providing something their children have been without for too long. They want to help. Emma nodded, understanding that to refuse would be to deny them partnership in this endeavor. Then I'll gratefully accept. When might I expect to meet the children? Word has already spread that school will begin as soon as the classroom is ready. I'd expect you'll have your first pupils by tomorrow or the next day at the latest. He paused, seeming to debate his next words. There's something else you should know. Not all the children speak English as their first language. We have families from Cornwall, Ireland, Italy, and a few from China who work the tailings. Emma's mind immediately began cataloguing the challenges this would present, but also the opportunities. I taught at a charity school in Boston, where many of the children were immigrants. We'll manage. Thomas studied her with undisguised admiration. Most people would see that as an insurmountable problem. Most people underestimate what children can accomplish when given the chance to learn, Emma replied. Now shall we discuss what supplies are immediately needed? I have some books and teaching materials in my trunk, but we'll need slates, chalk, perhaps a larger blackboard for the front of the room. They spent the next hour making lists of necessities for both the classroom and the small medical practice Emma hoped to establish. Thomas proved to have a practical mind and an unexpected knowledge of medical supplies. My father was the company doctor at a mine in Pennsylvania, he explained when Emma remarked on this. I grew up helping him prepare for mining accidents. Yet you became a mining foreman rather than following in his footsteps. A shadow crossed his face. I had planned to study medicine, but when the mine collapsed and took my father with it, there was no money for university. Mining was the work available, so mining was what I did. Emma heard the layers of loss in those simple words, not just of a father, but of a future envisioned and then denied. It echoed her own experience after her parents' deaths had forced her to abandon hopes of formal medical training. I'm sorry, she said simply. Thomas shook his head, as if to dispel old ghosts. It was a long time ago, and the work I do now matters, making the mines safer, advocating for the men. My father would have understood. The sound of female voices outside interrupted their conversation. Through the downstairs window, Emma could see a group of women approaching, carrying buckets, brooms, and bundles of cleaning supplies. The first volunteers, Thomas said with a small smile. I should leave you to it. Mining business won't wait. Even on such an important day, Emma walked him to the door, suddenly reluctant to see him go. Thank you, Mr. Sullivan, for everything. Thomas, he said, if we're to be working together for the benefit of the camp, you might as well use my given name. Then you must call me Emma. She extended her hand, and he took it briefly, the contact sending an unexpected warmth up her arm. Welcome to Silverton, Emma, he said, his voice low and sincere. I think you'll find it has a way of growing on you, despite the rough edges. As he walked away, Emma had the distinct impression he was speaking of more than just the town. The women who arrived to help clean were a revelation to Emma, not in their willingness to work, which she had expected, but in the diversity of their backgrounds and the strength of their characters. Maria Rossi, whose husband worked as a blaster in the mine, took charge of the kitchen area, showing Emma how to coax the best heat from the small stove, and which local merchants gave fair prices to mining families. Bridget O'Connor, mother of 5 and wife to a timberman, tackled the classroom with ferocious energy, insisting that every surface be scrubbed twice. Sarah Chen, whose husband worked sorting ore, brought homemade soap that filled the rooms with the scent of pine as she methodically cleaned every window until they sparkled in the spring sunlight. As they worked, Emma learned more about Silverton and its inhabitants than she could have discovered in weeks of observation. The women spoke freely of their lives, their children, the challenges of raising families in a place where danger was. A daily companion and comforts were few. My James lost 3 fingers last year when a support beam snapped, Bridget said matter-of-factly as she attacked a particularly stubborn patch of grime on the counter. Would have lost the whole hand if Thomas Sullivan hadn't been there to apply a tourniquet and get him to that butcher who calls himself the company doctor in time. Sullivan's a good man, Maria agreed, her English heavily accented but clear. Not like most bosses. He comes from the same dirt as our men, knows what it means to go down in that hole every day. And never married? Emma asked, trying to sound merely conversational as she scrubbed the classroom floor alongside the women. The knowing glances exchanged between the women told her she had not been as subtle as she'd hoped. Bridget laughed, a warm, rich sound that filled the room. Plenty have tried to catch his eye, but he's particular, that one. Married to the mine, some say, though I think it's more that he's waiting for someone who understands what he's fighting for. Sarah, who had been quiet until now, spoke softly. My husband says Sullivan keeps a set of engineering books in his cabin, studies them at night, says he's designing better supports for the tunnels, ones that would cost more up front, but save lives in the long run. And let me guess, Emma said, sitting back on her heels, Mr. Hargrove doesn't see the value in such an investment. Maria's expression darkened. Hargrove sees value only in what can be counted and sold. Men's lives, widows' tears, these have no place in his ledger books. By midday, the transformation of the space was remarkable. The classroom gleamed with fresh cleanliness, and the upstairs rooms had been made cozy with small touches the women had brought, curtains for the windows, sewn from simple muslin, a colourful quilt for the bed, a rag rug beside it to warm feet on cold mornings. We know it's not what you might have had as Mrs. Hargrove, Bridget said as they prepared to leave, but we hope it will serve until you can make it your own. Emma looked around at what these women, strangers yesterday, had helped create for her. It's far better than anything I might have had in Mr. Hargrove's house, she said with complete honesty. There, I would have been surrounded by expensive things that weren't mine to touch or change. Here, I have a home that I can shape with my own hands. After the women left, promising to send their children the next morning, Emma returned to the boarding house to collect her trunk. Joshua Palmer insisted on helping her transport it to her new residence, and his mother provided a basket of provisions to stock her kitchen: flour, salt, sugar, coffee, and a small crock of butter. A housewarming gift, Martha said firmly, when Emma tried to protest. Besides, you'll be too busy with those children tomorrow to think about shopping. By evening, Emma had unpacked her few possessions, arranged her father's medical books on a shelf in the clinic area, and set up a small writing desk near the upstairs window where the light was best. She sat there now, watching as lamps were lit across Silverton, creating constellations of warmth in the gathering dusk. In Boston, her evenings had been filled with the constant demands of boarders, preparing meals, mending linens, keeping accounts that always seemed to show more going out than coming in. Here, for the first time in years, she had quiet, space to think, to plan. A knock at the door downstairs pulled her from her reverie. She descended, wondering if one of the women had returned with a forgotten item, and opened the door to find Richard Hargrove standing on her threshold, his expensive coat and hat making him look oddly out of place among the weathered buildings of the miners' quarter. "Miss Wilson," he said, his voice carrying the forced politeness of someone who considers himself to be doing a distasteful duty. "I see you found accommodations." Emma straightened her spine, thankful that she was standing in a freshly cleaned, orderly space rather than the dusty room he might have expected. "Mr. Hargrove, this is an unexpected visit." He glanced past her into the former assay office, now clearly being prepared as a classroom. "Word reached me that you've taken up residence in a building owned by the Miners' Association with plans to establish a school." His tone made it clear what he thought of such an enterprise. "The information is correct. I've been engaged to teach the miners' children and provide basic medical care." Hargrove's mouth tightened at the corners. "I see. And you didn't think to consult with me before making such arrangements. As the primary employer in Silverton, I have certain interests in how the community develops." Emma felt a flare of indignation at his presumption. "I wasn't aware I needed your permission to accept employment, Mr. Hargrove, particularly after you made it clear yesterday that you had no interest in my presence here." A muscle twitched in his jaw. "It's not a matter of permission, Miss Wilson, but of practicality. These miners can barely afford to feed their families, let alone pay a teacher. And as for medical care, we have a company doctor in Durango who visits twice a month. Encouraging these people to bypass proper medical channels could create liability issues for the mine." The calculated coldness of his concern struck Emma like a physical blow. Not for the miners' welfare, not for proper education or health care, but for potential legal complications that might affect his profits. "These people, as you call them, are willing to pool their meager resources to provide education for their children," she said, struggling to keep her voice level. "As for medical care, twice monthly visits from a doctor stationed a day's ride away is hardly sufficient for a community of this size, especially one where injuries are common." Hargrove removed his hat, running a hand through his perfectly groomed hair in a gesture of frustration. "You misunderstand me, Miss Wilson. I'm not opposed to education or medical care. I simply question whether this arrangement is sustainable or appropriate." "Appropriate?" Emma couldn't keep the edge from her voice now. "What precisely do you find inappropriate about children learning to read, or a trained nurse providing care to the injured?" "Your background," Hargrove said bluntly. "You arrived here as a prospective bride, not as a teacher or nurse. People will talk. Questions will be raised about your motivations." For a moment, Emma was too stunned by the hypocrisy to respond. This man, who had publicly rejected her without regard for her feelings or reputation, now presumed to lecture her about appearances. "My motivations are simple, Mr. Hargrove," she finally said, her voice cool and precise. "I came west to build a new life. The specific form that life takes has changed, but the goal remains the same. As for what people might say, I find I care far more about the gratitude of parents whose children will learn to read than the gossip of those with nothing better to do than question a woman's right to honest work." Hargrove's expression hardened, the mask of civility slipping to reveal the coldness beneath. "You've aligned yourself with certain elements in this town that have been troublesome to mine operations. Sullivan, in particular, seems to have taken a special interest in your situation. Mr. Sullivan has been kind enough to help me establish myself here. Yes, I fail to see how that concerns you." "It concerns me," Hargrove said, stepping closer, "because Sullivan has a history of encouraging unreasonable demands among the miners. Safety equipment that cuts into profits, shorter shifts that reduce production, medical benefits that create dependency. Adding education to his list of crusades will only further distract from the business at hand." Emma stood her ground, refusing to be intimidated. "If basic safety, reasonable working hours, and essential medical care are considered unreasonable demands, then perhaps the business model requires reconsideration, Mr. Hargrove." For a moment she thought he might lose his composure entirely. His face flushed, and his hand tightened on his hat brim until the fine felt began to crumple under his fingers. Then, with visible effort, he regained control. "I see Sullivan has already poisoned your perspective." "A pity." He replaced his hat, adjusting it with precise movements. "I came here to offer you an alternative, Miss Wilson. The Silver Peak mine could use someone with medical training to assist. Our company doctor during his visits. It would be a respectable position, with regular pay, more suitable to a woman of your background than this makeshift arrangement." The offer caught Emma off guard. It was, on the surface, more secure than her current situation, and yet she didn't hesitate in her response. "Thank you for the offer, Mr. Hargrove, but I must decline. I've given my word to the miners' families, and I intend to honor it." His smile was tight and cold. "As you wish, but should you reconsider, the offer remains open. Mining camps are harsh places, Miss Wilson. The novelty of your current situation may wear thin when winter comes, and you find yourself living above a drafty classroom. tending to children who will likely follow their fathers into the mines, regardless of what you teach them. Before Emma could respond to the calculated cruelty of his assessment, movement in the doorway behind Hargrove caught her attention. Thomas Sullivan stood there, his expression darkening as he took in the scene before him. "Hargrove," he said, his voice level but holding an unmistakable edge. "Didn't expect to find you in this part of town." Hargrove turned, his posture stiffening. "Sullivan, I was just explaining to Miss Wilson that her current arrangement might not be in her best interests." "Is that so?" Thomas moved to stand beside Emma, not touching her, but close enough that his presence felt like a tangible support. "And did Miss Wilson seem in need of your guidance on the matter?" The tension between the two men was palpable, years of conflict vibrating in the narrow space between them. Emma stepped forward, unwilling to be relegated to a passive observer in her own doorway. "Mr. Hargrove was concerned about the sustainability of the school," she said, her calm voice cutting through the tension. "I assured him that the arrangements made with the miners' families are satisfactory to all parties involved." Thomas's gaze never left Hargrove's face. "The Miners' Association owns this building, Hargrove. We decide how it's used, not Silver Peak Mine." "No, for now," Hargrove replied, the subtle threat hanging in the air. He turned back to Emma, offering a shallow bow that held no genuine respect. "Miss Wilson, I wish you luck in your endeavors. When reality sets in, my offer remains open." At that, he strode away, his polished boots incongruous against the rutted dirt path that led back to the main street. Emma released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. He has a remarkable talent for making offers that sound like threats. Thomas's expression softened as he turned to her. "I came to see if you needed help moving anything else from the boarding house, but it seems you've had enough excitement for one day." "On the contrary," Emma said, stepping back to invite him inside. "After that visit, I could use a friendly face. Would you care for some tea? Mrs. Palmer sent me away with enough provisions to survive a small siege." Thomas hesitated, and, for a moment, Emma feared she had overstepped some unspoken boundary of propriety, but then he nodded, removing his hat as he entered. "Tea would be welcome, thank you." As Emma busied herself with the stove upstairs, Thomas examined the transformation of the classroom with evident approval. "The women did a fine job," he called up. "It looks like a proper school already." "They were remarkable," Emma agreed, descending with 2 steaming cups. "Not just in their work ethic, but in their knowledge and determination. I've rarely met such capable women. Mining towns forge strong people, men and women both." Thomas accepted the offered cup with a nod of thanks. "It's not an easy life, but those who endure it develop a certain resilience." They sat at one of the small tables that would soon serve as a student desk, the impromptu nature of the arrangement somehow making it easier to speak frankly. "Mr. Hargrove seems concerned about your influence on the miners," Emma observed, watching Thomas over the rim of her cup. A wry smile crossed his face. "Hargrove believes a content worker is a potentially rebellious worker. He prefers to keep the men desperate enough to accept whatever conditions he sets, but not quite desperate enough to risk losing their positions entirely. A precarious balance to maintain, and one that relies on ignorance," Thomas added. "Which is why education, for the children and eventually for the miners themselves, threatens his control. Knowledge leads to questions. Questions lead to demands. Demands lead to change." Emma considered this, understanding now why Hargrove had appeared so swiftly after learning of her plans for the school. "So, his objection wasn't really about my reputation or the sustainability of the arrangement." "Hargrove doesn't care about your reputation, Emma. He cares about his profits and his control. Anything that threatens either becomes a target." Thomas's expression grew serious. "If you stay and do this work, you should know you're entering into a conflict that began long before you arrived. Hargrove won't make it easy." Emma thought of the women who had spent their precious free time cleaning her new home, of the children who would arrive tomorrow eager to learn, of the community that had welcomed her despite the circumstances of her arrival. "I've never expected easy," she said finally, "only worthwhile." Something shifted in Thomas's expression, respect deepening into admiration, and perhaps something more. "Then we're fortunate you came to Silverton, even if it wasn't in the way. You planned." The simple sincerity of his words warmed her more than the tea. For the first time since stepping off the train, Emma felt she had found not just a place to stay, but a place to belong. Not because of who she might have married, but because of what she could contribute. It was a revelation as vast as the mountains rising outside her window, and just as solid. As twilight deepened into true night, Thomas took his leave, promising to return in the morning to help arrange the classroom for its first day. Standing in the doorway, watching his figure disappear into the darkness, Emma felt a curious mixture of anticipation and contentment. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, certainly, but also the beginning of something meaningful, something that was entirely her own choice. She closed the door and climbed the stairs to her small apartment, where the lamp cast a warm glow over her books and the few personal treasures she had brought from Boston. Outside, the mountains stood as silent sentinels against the star-filled sky, and somewhere in the distance, a miner's wife sang a lullaby in a language Emma didn't recognize, but whose emotion needed no translation. Silverton might not have welcomed her in the way she had imagined, but perhaps it had welcomed her in the way she needed. Not as an ornament in a wealthy man's home, but as a builder of something essential: education, healing, community. The rejection that had seemed so devastating only yesterday now felt like a doorway to possibility, a chance to create rather than merely exist within someone else's creation. As she prepared for bed, Emma found herself looking forward to tomorrow, with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. Richard Hargrove had rejected her, yes, but in doing so, he had unwittingly given her the freedom to become something far more valuable than a mine owner's wife. Emma awoke before dawn, her mind already racing with preparations for her first day of teaching. The air in her small apartment held the deep chill of mountain mornings, and she pulled the colorful quilt tighter around her shoulders for a moment, savoring its warmth before facing the cold floor. Outside her window, the first gray light outlined the jagged peaks surrounding Silverton, their snow-capped summits catching hints of pink as the hidden sun began its ascent. She dressed quickly in her most practical skirt and shirtwaist, then coaxed the stove to life, grateful for Maria Rossi's careful instructions the day before. While the room gradually warmed and water heated for coffee, Emma reviewed the plans she had crafted late into the previous night. Lessons appropriate for various ages and abilities, organization of limited supplies, a schedule that would allow her to divide her attention among what she assumed would be a diverse group of students. By the time she descended to the classroom, the sun had cleared the eastern ridge, sending shafts of golden light through the freshly cleaned windows. Emma moved through the room, making final preparations, arranging slates and pencils, positioning the small blackboard where all could see it, setting out the few books she had brought from Boston that might serve as readers for those who already knew their letters. The door opened behind her, and she turned to find Thomas Sullivan carrying a large wooden crate, his breath visible in the still, cool morning air. "Good morning," he said, setting the crate on the nearest table. "Thought you might need a few more supplies before your students arrive." Emma peered into the crate and found an assortment of items that brought unexpected tears to her eyes. Chalk in several colors, a stack of simple notebooks, pencils, a world map that had seen better days, but was still perfectly usable. And most, surprising of all, a brass bell with a wooden handle. "Every proper school needs a bell," Thomas explained, a hint of self-consciousness in his voice as he lifted it from the crate. "For calling students in from their play yard or signaling the end of lessons." Emma took the bell, its weight solid and reassuring in her hand. "It's perfect, all of it is. But where did you find these things on such short notice?" "The mercantile had most of it in stock. Miners' children need supplies too, even without a formal school. The bell came from an abandoned claim up the valley. Used to signal shift changes." He hesitated, then added, "I cleaned off the rust best I could." The thought of him taking time to restore the bell made the gift even more meaningful. "Thank you, Thomas. This will make such a difference." A hint of color touched his weathered cheeks. "It's nothing compared to what you're doing for these children." Before Emma could respond, the door opened again, admitting a small girl of perhaps 6 years, her dark hair neatly braided and tied with faded ribbon. She clutched a cloth sack in one hand and her mother's skirt with the other, eyes wide as she took in the transformed space. "Good morning," Emma said warmly, setting the bell on her desk and crossing to kneel before the child. "You must be my first student. I'm Miss Wilson. What's your name?" The girl looked up at her mother, who nodded encouragement. "Sophia Rossi," she said in a small voice. "Maria's daughter," Thomas explained. "One of our best blasters' children." Maria smiled proudly. "She has been awake since before dawn, too excited to sleep. I told her the teacher would not arrive so early, but she insisted." "I'm glad she did," Emma said, rising. "Sophia can help me prepare for the other students." "Would you like that, Sophia?" The girl nodded, her initial shyness beginning to fade. "I'll leave you to your work," Thomas said, moving toward the door. "The other children won't be far behind once word spreads that school has officially begun." He was right. Within the hour, the classroom had filled with 27 children, ranging in age from 5 to 15, their faces reflecting the diverse heritage of Silverton's mining community. Irish and Cornish children with fair skin and freckles sat beside darker complexioned Italian youngsters, while 3 solemn-faced Chinese children stayed close together near the back of the room, their expressions watchful but eager. The parents who accompanied the youngest children offered Emma uncertain smiles and halting explanations of their children's previous education. Most had none, though a few had attended school briefly in their home countries or in larger American cities before their families had moved west seeking better opportunities. One mother pressed a small jar of honey into Emma's hands, while another offered a loaf of freshly baked bread. Small gifts, representing significant sacrifices for these families. "For teacher," a Chinese woman said shyly, presenting a small packet of tea wrapped in red paper. "Good fortune." Emma accepted each gift with genuine gratitude, understanding that they represented not just welcome, but investment. These parents were entrusting her with their most precious possessions, their children, and signaling their support for her success. As the parents departed and the children settled at the tables or on the floor near the blackboard, Emma rang the bell Thomas had given her, its clear tone bringing immediate, attentive silence. "Good morning," she said, looking at each face in turn. "My name is Miss Wilson and I am honored to be your teacher. In this room, we will learn many things together, reading and writing, mathematics and science, history and geography. But perhaps the most important thing we will learn is how to respect and learn from each other's differences. Each of you comes from a family with its own language, traditions and knowledge. Those differences make our classroom richer, not divided." Emma saw uncertainty in some faces, curiosity in others, and in the oldest children, a touch of skepticism. She had expected no less. Words alone wouldn't convince them. Only consistent action over time would build the trust she needed to teach effectively. "Now, I'd like each of you to tell me your name, your age, and one thing you hope to learn in school. Who would like to begin?" A freckle-faced boy of about 10 raised his hand with confident eagerness. "I'm Patrick O'Connor. I'm 10 years old, and I want to learn enough figures to keep the mine bosses from cheating my pa on his pay." A ripple of murmurs and nods spread through the older children, and Emma realized she had stumbled into one of the underlying tensions of the mining community, the suspicion among workers that their labor was not fairly compensated. "Mathematics is certainly important for many reasons," she said carefully, "including understanding fair payment for work. What else would others like to learn?" The children's responses revealed much about their lives and hopes. The youngest wanted to read stories. Several boys hoped to learn engineering to build safer mines, and one girl quietly admitted she wanted to become a nurse like Miss Wilson. The 3 Chinese children, with halting English, expressed desire to learn enough of the language to help their parents navigate the white-dominated town. With this foundation laid, Emma began the challenging work of assessing each child's current knowledge. She divided them into groups based on reading ability, giving the more advanced students simple texts to read while she worked with beginners on letter recognition. The variety of accents and language backgrounds made the task more complex, but by mid-morning, Emma had established a working structure that allowed her to rotate her attention among the groups. During the lunch break, as children ate their modest meals of bread, cheese, or leftovers from home, Emma noticed Sophia Rossi sitting alone, her cloth sack empty beside her. Without drawing attention, Emma approached and casually shared half of the bread Maria had sent with her daughter. "I find I have more than I can eat," she said simply, allowing the child to maintain dignity as she accepted the food. Emma made a mental note to organize some form of shared meal program. Perhaps the mothers could take turns preparing a large pot of soup each day. In a mining community where wages were inconsistent and resources stretched thin, hunger was an obstacle to learning she could help address. The afternoon brought new challenges as Emma introduced basic mathematical concepts to a group where some children could already multiply large numbers in their heads, while others struggled to recognize written numerals. She implemented a buddy system, pairing stronger students with those who needed more support, a strategy that had served her well in Boston's charity schools. As the final hour of the school day approached, Emma gathered all the children for a geography lesson, using the map Thomas had provided to show them the vastness of the world beyond Silverton's mountains. "Many of your families came from distant places to find opportunity here," she said, pointing out Ireland, Italy, China, and the various states from which their parents had journeyed. "Each place has its own history, traditions, and knowledge that your families brought with them. In this classroom, we'll learn about all these places and more." When the school day finally ended and the last child had departed with promises to return tomorrow, Emma sank into her chair, exhilarated and exhausted in equal measure. The challenges were immense. Different ages, languages, abilities all crammed into one room with limited resources. But the children's eager responses and quick minds gave her hope that she could truly make a difference in their lives. She was gathering papers when a knock came at the door. Thomas stood there, his expression suggesting both concern and curiosity. "How was the first day?" he asked, stepping inside. Emma smiled, the weariness in her body contradicted by the energy in her voice. "Challenging, enlightening, exactly where I'm meant to be." Relief visibly washed over his features. "I worried it might be overwhelming. 27 children speaking 4 different languages. It was overwhelming," Emma admitted with a laugh, "but wonderfully so. The children are bright and eager to learn. Some have had no schooling, yet they've developed remarkable skills just through living in this multilingual community." Thomas glanced at the notes she had made throughout the day, his brow furrowing. "You've identified needs already?" "Yes. Books appropriate for various reading levels, materials for teaching scientific concepts, and most urgently, some form of meal program. Several children came with little or no food. Thomas nodded grimly. The mines haven't been paying regularly. Hargrove claims cash flow problems while he builds that mansion on the hill. His jaw tightened. Families are choosing between rent, food, or medicine. Emma thought of the children who had struggled to concentrate as the day progressed. Hunger, gnawing at their concentration. That's unacceptable. These are hard-working people producing wealth from the earth. They deserve to be paid fairly and promptly. You're preaching to the converted, Thomas said with a wry smile. But Hargrove controls the purse strings and the property. He knows the miners can't easily leave. Where would they go? Other mining operations are just as exploitative. Emma began packing her satchel, her mind already forming plans. Then, we must work within the constraints of the current situation. I'll speak with Martha Palmer about organizing community meals for the school children. Perhaps the women could contribute what they can, and we could supplement from other sources. Such as... Emma's smile held a glint of determination. I noticed Mr. Hargrove's name prominently displayed on the list of church benefactors. Perhaps Reverend Collins might approach him about supporting a meal program for the miners' children as an act of Christian charity. It would be difficult for Hargrove to refuse publicly, especially with his social aspirations. Thomas's surprised laugh filled the classroom. You've been here 3 days, and already you're learning how to navigate Silverton politics, using Hargrove's pride against his greed. I wish I'd thought of that. I taught in charity schools in Boston, Emma reminded him. Securing donations from wealthy patrons was an essential skill. They walked together into the late afternoon sunlight, the air already cooling as the sun slipped behind the western peaks. A group of miners trudged down the main street, their clothing dust-covered, their faces etched with the exhaustion of men who had spent hours in darkness, chipping at unyielding stone. Afternoon shift ending, Thomas explained, raising a hand. In greeting to the men, several of whom nodded back respectfully. They'll be home just in time to hear their children's excited accounts of their first day at school. Emma watched the miners' weary progress, imagining the small moments of joy awaiting them despite their exhaustion. A child proudly showing off newly formed letters, a wife with dinner waiting, the brief comfort of home before sleep claimed. Them and the cycle began again tomorrow. Their lives are so hard, she murmured, yet they prioritize education for their children, even when it means additional sacrifice. They sacrifice so their children might have choices they never had. Thomas's voice held a depth of understanding that reminded Emma he had grown up in a similar community. A miner with no education has few options beyond following the next vein of ore until his body or the mountain breaks. A figure on horseback caught Emma's attention, Richard Hargrove riding toward them on his gleaming chestnut gelding, his clothing immaculate despite the dusty streets. He reined his horse to a stop before them, looking down with an expression of calculated civility. Miss Wilson, I see you've completed your first day of instruction. His tone suggested he considered her efforts little more than well-intentioned play. The children are remarkably quick learners, Mr. Hargrove, Emma replied pleasantly. Some show particular aptitude for mathematics and engineering concepts. Future mine managers, perhaps. Hargrove's smile tightened at her implication that the miners' children might one day rise to positions of authority. How charitable of you to nurture such unlikely ambitions. It's not charity to recognize potential, sir, merely good sense. Thomas shifted beside her, his stance protective, though he hadn't moved closer. Did you need something, Hargrove? The shift change reports won't be ready until morning. Hargrove's attention shifted to Thomas, his expression cooling further. Actually, Sullivan, I came to inform Miss Wilson that the company doctor will be visiting Silverton tomorrow. As I mentioned previously, he handles all medical matters related to mine operations. My medical services are available to anyone who needs them, Emma said. But I have no intention of interfering with your company doctor's authority. Good, Hargrove nodded curtly. Dr. Wallace has been caring for Silverton residents for 5 years. It would be inappropriate for an untested newcomer to undermine established medical practice. The warning was clear, wrapped though it was in polite language. Emma kept her expression neutral. I look forward to meeting Dr. Wallace. Perhaps he might appreciate assistance during his visits, given the size of the community. Hargrove's eyebrows rose slightly, as if surprised by her failure to be intimidated. I'll mention your offer to him, though I should warn you, he's rather traditional in his views about women in medicine. Most men are, until they need help. During an emergency, Emma replied evenly. Good evening, Mr. Hargrove. With a tip of his hat that managed to be both proper and dismissive, Hargrove continued on his way, the hoofbeats of his expensive mount echoing against the wooden buildings. Thomas exhaled slowly once Hargrove was out of earshot. He's worried. About me providing medical care, Emma asked, surprised. About losing control. The company doctor charges fees most miners can't afford, sending them deeper into debt to the company store. If you provide an alternative, he let the implication hang in the air between them. Another thread in his web of dependency, Emma realized. The miners owe the company for housing, food, equipment, and medical care, ensuring they can never quite break free. Thomas nodded grimly. It's a system designed to extract maximum profit from both the mountain and the men who work. They had reached the former assay office, now transformed into Emma's school and home. The late afternoon light cast long shadows across the worn boards of the porch, and somewhere nearby, a mother called her children in for supper. Will you join me for tea? Emma asked impulsively. I'd like to discuss ideas for the school, including how we might address the children's hunger without creating more conflict with Mr. Hargrove. Thomas hesitated, and Emma suddenly realized how her invitation might appear to others. A single woman asking a man to her quarters, even for an innocent purpose, could spark gossip in a small town. We could remain downstairs in the classroom, she added quickly. Perfectly proper. A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. Silverton runs on gossip regardless of propriety, Emma. If you're worried about your reputation, having tea with the mine foreman is the least of your concerns after arriving as Hargrove's mail-order bride. The blunt assessment startled a laugh from her. You're right, of course. My reputation was compromised the moment I stepped off that train. All the more reason not to worry about appearances now. I didn't say that, Thomas corrected gently. I only meant that this town will talk regardless of what you do, so you might as well do what you believe is right. It was the most personal conversation they had shared, touching on the underlying currents of propriety and judgment that shaped life in small communities. Emma appreciated his honesty, his refusal to pretend Silverton would not gossip, while simultaneously encouraging her to rise above such concerns. What I believe is right, she said firmly, is discussing how to help hungry children over a cup of tea with someone who shares that concern. The classroom or my sitting room, whichever location makes you more comfortable. Thomas's expression softened, respect evident in his gaze. The classroom is fine. I should stay only a short while. I have night shift reports to review. They settled at one of the students' tables, the incongruity of their adult frames on. Furniture designed for children, adding a touch of humor to the scene. Emma prepared tea using the small spirit lamp she kept in the classroom for demonstrations, and they discussed practical matters, the need for additional books, the possibility of community meals, strategies for teaching children of such varied backgrounds. As their conversation progressed, Emma found herself increasingly impressed by Thomas's breadth of knowledge. He spoke of educational theories she had encountered only in the most progressive Boston circles, discussed the merits of various teaching approaches, and offered insights about each family's particular circumstances that would help her understand her students better. "You're remarkably well informed about education for a mining foreman," she observed during a pause in their discussion. Thomas looked momentarily discomfited, as if caught in something improper. "I read. When my plans for medical school ended, I didn't stop learning. The mining company library in Pennsylvania had a decent collection, and I've continued to order books when I can afford them." "What kinds of books?" "Engineering texts, mostly. Some medical journals. Educational philosophy when I can find it." He shrugged, a hint of defensiveness in the gesture. "Knowledge shouldn't be limited to those who can afford university." Emma thought of her father, who had educated her far beyond what was considered appropriate for young women, sharing medical texts and scientific journals despite society's disapproval. "I couldn't agree more. My father believed education was a right, not a privilege. He taught me everything he could, even when others thought it improper for a girl to learn anatomy and physiology." "Your father sounds like a wise man." "He was. He treated all patients with equal care and dignity, regardless of their ability to pay." Emma's voice softened with memory. "He often said the measure of a society was how it treated its most vulnerable members." Thomas nodded slowly. "By that measure, Silverton has much room for improvement." "As does most of the world," Emma acknowledged. "But improvement begins with those willing to see problems clearly and address them honestly." She studied him across the table, this man who read educational philosophy while managing a dangerous mine, who restored a bell for her classroom when he could have been resting after his shift. "You're an unusual man, Thomas Sullivan." He met her gaze steadily. "And you're an unusual woman, Emma Wilson. Most would have returned east after Hargrove's rejection. Most would never have come west alone in the first place," she countered. A smile warmed his features. "True enough." The evening light had faded into dusk, shadows deepening in the corners of the classroom. Thomas rose reluctantly, aware of the late hour. "I should go. Morning shift starts early." Emma walked him to the door, a curious reluctance slowing her steps. Their conversation had been primarily about practical matters, yet something more substantial had developed beneath the surface. A recognition of shared values, similar perspectives, despite their different backgrounds. "Thank you for the school supplies," she said as they reached the door. "Especially the bell. It made all the difference today." "I'm glad." He hesitated, then added, "If there's anything else you need for the school or otherwise, please ask." Silverton can be an unforgiving place for newcomers. "You've already been more than kind," Emma replied. "I don't know how I would have managed these past days without your help." Something shifted in Thomas's expression, a softening around his eyes, a slight parting of his lips as if words hovered there unspoken. But whatever he might have said remained unuttered as the door to the building across the street burst open and a woman rushed out, her face contorted with panic. "Mr. Sullivan!" she cried, running toward them. "Come quick! It's my James! He's having one of his breathing fits, worse than ever." Thomas was instantly alert, all personal matters forgotten. "Mrs. O'Connor, when did it start?" "Just now. Came home from shift coughing blood. Can't catch his breath." Tears streamed down Bridget O'Connor's face as she clutched at Thomas's arm. "The children are terrified. Please, he trusts you." Emma had already turned back into the classroom, retrieving her father's medical bag. "I'm coming too," she said, brooking no argument. "This sounds like miner's consumption. I've treated similar cases in Boston. Thomas nodded sharply, accepting her expertise without question. The O'Connors live 3 streets over. We'll be faster on foot than trying to find a wagon at this hour. They hurried through Silverton's darkening streets, following Bridget's desperate pace. Emma's mind raced through possible treatments for what sounded like advanced silicosis, the dreaded miner's consumption that claimed so many who worked extracting ore from the earth. Her father had treated dock workers with similar symptoms, their lungs damaged by years of inhaling coal dust during unloading. The O'Connor home was a small cabin on the edge of town, light spilling from its windows into the gathering darkness. Inside, they found James O'Connor sitting upright in a chair, his face grey beneath his red beard, lips tinged blue as he struggled for breath. Blood-flecked spittle dotted his shirt, and each inhalation produced a terrible rattling sound. 5. Children of various ages huddled together on a narrow bed in the corner, their eyes wide with fear as they watched their father fight for air. Emma set down her bag and moved to O'Connor's side, taking his wrist to check his pulse while assessing his overall condition. "Mr. O'Connor, I'm Emma Wilson. I have medical training. I'd like to help you, if you'll permit it." The miner looked to Thomas, who nodded reassuringly. "She knows what she's doing, James. Let her help." O'Connor managed a jerky nod, his attention immediately returning to the desperate work of breathing. Emma opened her medical bag, withdrawing her stethoscope and a small bottle of medication. "Mrs. O'Connor, I need hot water, as much steam as possible. Put a kettle on to boil, and then place hot, wet towels around his shoulders." She turned to Thomas. "Help me move him closer to the stove. The heat and moisture may help loosen what's in his lungs." As they worked, Emma administered a careful dose of the medication she had brought, an extract of thornapple that her father had found effective in relaxing the airways of patients with breathing difficulties. She listened to O'Connor's chest, with her stethoscope, noting the congestion deep in his lungs, the labored effort of his heart. "How long has he been having these episodes?" she asked Bridget, who was frantically heating water as directed. "Years now, but worse these past months. The company doctor gives him powders that help some, but they cost nearly a week's wages." Her voice broke. "Last winter he couldn't work for a month. We nearly lost the cabin." Emma continued her examination, recognizing the classic progression of miner's lung disease. The early cough dismissed as normal, gradually worsening until episodes like this one threatened the sufferer's life and livelihood simultaneously. "The mineral dust damages the lungs over time," she explained to Bridget, keeping her voice calm for the children's benefit. "Each attack leaves scarring, making the next one more likely. There's no cure, but we can manage the symptoms and perhaps slow the progression." As the medication began to take effect and the steam from hot towels helped loosen the congestion, O'Connor's breathing gradually eased. The terrible blue tinge receded from his lips, and his death grip on the chair arms relaxed slightly. Emma continued monitoring him, showing Bridget how to apply firm but gentle pressure to specific points on his back to help clear his airways. "You need to rest for several days," Emma told O'Connor once he could speak. "No returning to the mine until the blood in your sputum is completely gone." Fear flickered across the miner's face. "Can't miss shifts. Foreman will give my spot to another." Thomas stepped forward. "Not while I'm foreman, James. Your position is secure. Rest and recover properly this time." Relief and gratitude washed over O'Connor's features, followed quickly by concern. "But the pay? We can't." "I'll speak with the Mutual Aid Society," Thomas said firmly. "The Miners' Fund exists for exactly this situation. Your family won't go hungry while you recover." Emma repacked her medical bag, leaving Bridget with detailed instructions and some of her precious medicine. "I'll return tomorrow to check on him," she promised. "If his breathing worsens during the night, send one of the older children to fetch me immediately." Outside, the night had fully claimed Silverton, stars blazing overhead with the crystalline clarity unique to mountain elevations. Emma and Thomas walked in silence for several minutes, both processing what they had witnessed. "How many miners suffer from this condition?" Emma finally asked. "Most who've been working more than 5 years have some degree of lung damage," Thomas replied grimly. "The older tunnels have poor ventilation, and blasting fills the air with dust that men breathe for hours. Hargrove refuses to invest in proper ventilation systems or dust reduction measures. Because they're expensive, because they might reduce output by a few percentages while being installed." The bitterness in Thomas's voice was palpable. Men's lives against a temporary dip in profits. To Hargrove, it's not even a question worth considering. They had reached the former assay office, but neither moved to end the conversation. The shared experience of treating O'Connor had created a different kind of intimacy between them, the kind that comes from working together in a crisis, seeing each other's competence and compassion in action. "You handled that situation expertly," Thomas said, his voice softening. "O'Connor trusts few people during his attacks. The fact that he allowed you to treat him speaks volumes." "He was desperate," Emma demurred, "and you vouched for me." "I did," Thomas acknowledged, "but I've seen men in that state refuse help even from those they know well. There's something about you, Emma, a quiet confidence that inspires trust." "Years now, but worse these past months. The company doctor gives him powders that help some, but they cost nearly a week's wages." Her voice broke. "Last winter he couldn't work for a month. We nearly lost the cabin." Emma continued her examination, recognizing the classic progression of miner's lung disease. The early cough dismissed as normal, gradually worsening until episodes like this one threatened the sufferer's life and livelihood simultaneously. "The mineral dust damages the lungs over time," she explained to Bridget, keeping her voice calm for the children's benefit. "Each attack leaves scarring, making the next one more likely. There's no cure, but we can manage the symptoms and perhaps slow the progression." As the medication began to take effect and the steam from hot towels helped loosen the congestion, O'Connor's breathing gradually eased. The terrible blue tinge receded from his lips, and his death grip on the chair arms relaxed slightly. Emma continued monitoring him, showing Bridget how to apply firm but gentle pressure to specific points on his back to help clear his airways. "You need to rest for several days," Emma told O'Connor once he could speak. "No returning to the mine until the blood in your sputum is completely gone." Fear flickered across the miner's face. "Can't miss shifts. Foreman will give my spot to another." Thomas stepped forward. "Not while I'm foreman, James. Your position is secure. Rest and recover properly this time." Relief and gratitude washed over O'Connor's features, followed quickly by concern. "But the pay? We can't." "I'll speak with the Mutual Aid Society," Thomas said firmly. "The Miners' Fund exists for exactly this situation. Your family won't go hungry while you recover." Emma repacked her medical bag, leaving Bridget with detailed instructions and some of her precious medicine. "I'll return tomorrow to check on him," she promised. "If his breathing worsens during the night, send one of the older children to fetch me immediately." Outside, the night had fully claimed Silverton, stars blazing overhead with the crystalline clarity unique to mountain elevations. Emma and Thomas walked in silence for several minutes, both processing what they had witnessed. "How many miners suffer from this condition?" Emma finally asked. "Most who've been working more than 5 years have some degree of lung damage," Thomas replied grimly. "The older tunnels have poor ventilation, and blasting fills the air with dust that men breathe for hours. Hargrove refuses to invest in proper ventilation systems or dust reduction measures. Because they're expensive, because they might reduce output by a few percentages while being installed." The bitterness in Thomas's voice was palpable. Men's lives against a temporary dip in profits. To Hargrove, it's not even a question worth considering. They had reached the former assay office, but neither moved to end the conversation. The shared experience of treating O'Connor had created a different kind of intimacy between them, the kind that comes from working together in a crisis, seeing each other's competence and compassion in action. "You handled that situation expertly," Thomas said, his voice softening. "O'Connor trusts few people during his attacks. The fact that he allowed you to treat him speaks volumes." "He was desperate," Emma demurred, "and you vouched for me." "I did," Thomas acknowledged, "but I've seen men in that state refuse help even from those they know well. There's something about you, Emma, a quiet confidence that inspires trust." The compliment warmed her more than it should have. "My father taught me that patients respond as much to a healer's manner as to their medicine. Panic breeds panic. Calm encourages calm." Thomas studied her in the dim light spilling from her classroom windows. "Your father would be proud of how you've applied his teachings." The simple statement touched a place in Emma's heart that had been bruised by years of struggle after her parents' deaths. The constant question of whether she was honoring their legacy properly, using the knowledge they had sacrificed to give her. "Thank you for saying that," she said softly. "I hope he would be." Thomas took a step closer, close enough that Emma could see the play of shadows across his features, the genuine respect in his gaze. "I should let you rest. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges." "Yes," Emma agreed, though neither moved to separate. The night air between them seemed charged with unspoken possibilities, with questions and answers hovering just beyond articulation. Finally, Thomas broke the spell, taking a deliberate step back. "Good night, Emma. Thank you for what you did for James and his family." "Good night, Thomas. Thank you for trusting my abilities." As she watched him walk away, his figure gradually absorbed by the darkness, Emma felt a curious mixture of emotions: professional satisfaction in having helped the O'Connor family, righteous anger at the conditions that had caused James's illness, and beneath it all, a growing warmth whenever she thought of Thomas Sullivan. She had come to Silverton expecting to be a mine owner's wife, living in comfort, isolated from the harsh realities of the community. Instead, she found herself immersed in those realities, using skills she had once feared would lie dormant, forming connections based on genuine respect rather than social convention. As Emma prepared for bed, the events of the day swirled in. Her mind, the children's eager faces in the classroom, Hargrove's thinly veiled threats, the desperate struggle for breath in James O'Connor's cabin, and Thomas's steady presence through it all. Silverton was revealing itself to her layer by layer, its harshness and beauty, its struggles and strengths. She had been in town just 3 days, yet already she felt more rooted, more purposeful than she had in years. Richard Hargrove's rejection, which had seemed so devastating on that train platform, now appeared increasingly like a fortunate escape, not just from an unsuitable marriage, but from a life of complicity in the very system that was slowly killing men like James O'Connor. Sleep came slowly that night, but when it did, Emma's dreams were not of Boston's familiar streets or of paths not taken, but of mountains bathed in morning light, of children's voices raised in learning, and of eyes the color of the Colorado, sky looking at her with unwavering respect. The next morning dawned with the pale clarity particular to high mountain regions, the air so crisp it almost crackled. Emma had been awake since before sunrise, preparing for her second day of teaching, while mentally reviewing the treatments she had administered to James O'Connor. She would need to check on him later, perhaps during the children's midday break, and she wanted to bring some of the herbal preparations her father had found effective for lung ailments. As she descended to the classroom, a knock at the door caught her by surprise. The children weren't due for another hour. She opened it. To to find a tall, imposing man with steel-grey hair and a black leather medical bag, his expression one of barely contained irritation. "Miss Wilson?" he asked, his tone suggesting he already knew the answer and disapproved of it. "Yes, and you must be Dr. Wallace." Emma extended her hand, which he regarded for a moment before reluctantly shaking. "Indeed, I understand you've been administering treatments to minors without proper consultation, specifically to James O'Connor last night." Emma stepped back, gesturing for him to enter. The compliment warmed her more than it should have. "My father taught me that patients respond as much to a healer's manner as to their medicine. Panic breeds panic. Calm encourages calm." Thomas studied her in the dim light spilling from her classroom windows. "Your father would be proud of how you've applied his teachings." The simple statement touched a place in Emma's heart that had been bruised by years of struggle after her parents' deaths. The constant question of whether she was honoring their legacy properly, using the knowledge they had sacrificed to give her. "Thank you for saying that," she said softly. "I hope he would be." Thomas took a step closer, close enough that Emma could see the play of shadows across his features, the genuine respect in his gaze. "I should let you rest. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges." "Yes," Emma agreed, though neither moved to separate. The night air between them seemed charged with unspoken possibilities, with questions and answers hovering just beyond articulation. Finally, Thomas broke the spell, taking a deliberate step back. "Good night, Emma. Thank you for what you did for James and his family." "Good night, Thomas. Thank you for trusting my abilities." As she watched him walk away, his figure gradually absorbed by the darkness, Emma felt a curious mixture of emotions: professional satisfaction in having helped the O'Connor family, righteous anger at the conditions that had caused James's illness, and beneath it all, a growing warmth whenever she thought of Thomas Sullivan. She had come to Silverton expecting to be a mine owner's wife, living in comfort, isolated from the harsh realities of the community. Instead, she found herself immersed in those realities, using skills she had once feared would lie dormant, forming connections based on genuine respect rather than social convention. As Emma prepared for bed, the events of the day swirled in. Her mind, the children's eager faces in the classroom, Hargrove's thinly veiled threats, the desperate struggle for breath in James O'Connor's cabin, and Thomas's steady presence through it all. Silverton was revealing itself to her layer by layer, its harshness and beauty, its struggles and strengths. She had been in town just 3 days, yet already she felt more rooted, more purposeful than she had in years. Richard Hargrove's rejection, which had seemed so devastating on that train platform, now appeared increasingly like a fortunate escape, not just from an unsuitable marriage, but from a life of complicity in the very system that was slowly killing men like James O'Connor. Sleep came slowly that night, but when it did, Emma's dreams were not of Boston's familiar streets or of paths not taken, but of mountains bathed in morning light, of children's voices raised in learning, and of eyes the color of the Colorado, sky looking at her with unwavering respect. The next morning dawned with the pale clarity particular to high mountain regions, the air so crisp it almost crackled. Emma had been awake since before sunrise, preparing for her second day of teaching, while mentally reviewing the treatments she had administered to James O'Connor. She would need to check on him later, perhaps during the children's midday break, and she wanted to bring some of the herbal preparations her father had found effective for lung ailments. As she descended to the classroom, a knock at the door caught her by surprise. The children weren't due for another hour. She opened it, to find a tall, imposing man with steel-grey hair and a black leather medical bag, his expression one of barely contained irritation. "Miss Wilson?" he asked, his tone suggesting he already knew the answer and disapproved of it. "Yes, and you must be Dr. Wallace." Emma extended her hand, which he regarded for a moment before reluctantly shaking. Indeed, I understand you've been administering treatments to minors without proper consultation, specifically to James O'Connor last night. Emma stepped back, gesturing for him to enter. Mr. O'Connor was experiencing severe respiratory distress. I provided emergency care until he stabilized. Dr. Wallace entered, his critical gaze sweeping over the former assay office with its transformation into a classroom. Emergency care? With what qualifications, may I ask? My father was Dr. Edward Wilson of Boston. I assisted in his practice for 15 years, including treatment of dock workers with similar pulmonary conditions. The doctor harumphed, clearly unimpressed. Assisting is not the same as formal medical training, Miss Wilson. These mining communities have enough superstitious folk remedies without adding amateur treatments to the mix. Emma felt heat rise in her cheeks, but kept her voice steady. I administered thorn apple extract combined with hot steam therapy, hardly a folk remedy. It's a standard treatment for acute bronchospasm. Dr. Wallace's eyebrows rose slightly, perhaps surprised by her correct use of medical terminology. Nevertheless, medical care in Silverton falls under my purview. Mr. Hargrove has made it clear that all mine-related injuries and illnesses are to be treated exclusively by company physicians. Mr. O'Connor was at home, not in the mine, Emma pointed out. His wife sought help for a medical emergency. Would you have preferred I turned them away while they waited for your next scheduled visit? The doctor's mouth tightened, but before he could respond, the door opened again to admit Thomas Sullivan. He paused on the threshold, taking in the scene before him with a quick assessing glance. Dr. Wallace, didn't expect to see you here. Sullivan, the doctor nodded curtly. I came to speak with Miss Wilson about her interference in company medical matters. Thomas stepped fully into the room, his presence somehow making the space feel smaller. Saving a man's life is hardly interference. James O'Connor might not have survived the night without Miss Wilson's help. So I've heard, Dr. Wallace said dryly. Though I find it remarkable that a condition he's managed for years suddenly became life-threatening, just as a new healer arrived in town. Emma bristled at the implication. The progression of silicosis isn't linear, Doctor. Patients can be stable for months, then experience acute episodes that can indeed prove fatal without intervention. I'm sure your medical training covered this. Dr. Wallace's face flushed slightly at her pointed reminder of established medical facts. Be that as it may, Miss Wilson, I must insist that you refrain from treating minors or their families without proper consultation. These people don't understand the complexities of medical care. They may choose your convenient proximity over proper treatment to their detriment. Or perhaps, Thomas interjected quietly, they choose care they can actually access and afford, rather than treatments that drive them deeper into debt to the company store. The doctor's expression hardened. The company provides medical care as a service to its employees, Sullivan. If miners cannot afford that care, perhaps they should manage their wages more responsibly. Emma saw Thomas's jaw tighten, his hands closing into fists at his sides. She stepped forward, drawing Dr. Wallace's attention back to her before Thomas could respond with what she suspected might damage his position at the mine. Doctor, I have no intention of undermining your authority, she said diplomatically. My priority is the well-being of this community. If emergencies arise when you're not available, surely it's better that someone with knowledge provides care rather than no one at all. Dr. Wallace regarded her for a long moment, his expression calculating. Your point is noted, Miss Wilson. However, I expect to be informed of any treatments you administer, and I reserve the right to countermand them if I deem necessary. It wasn't quite acceptance, but it was a concession Emma hadn't expected. That seems reasonable. Perhaps we could establish a system for sharing information about patients. My father found that collaborative approaches often benefited difficult cases. A flicker of something, perhaps reluctant professional curiosity, crossed the doctor's face. Your father specialized in respiratory conditions. Among other things, he documented his treatments of dock workers and coal heavers extensively. I have his journals, if you'd be interested in reviewing them. Dr. Wallace hesitated, professional interest warring with his obvious desire to dismiss her. Mr. O'Connor was experiencing severe respiratory distress. I provided emergency care until he stabilized. Dr. Wallace entered, his critical gaze sweeping over the former assay office with its transformation into a classroom. Emergency care? With what qualifications, may I ask? My father was Dr. Edward Wilson of Boston. I assisted in his practice for 15 years, including treatment of dock workers with similar pulmonary conditions. The doctor harumphed, clearly unimpressed. Assisting is not the same as formal medical training, Miss Wilson. These mining communities have enough superstitious folk remedies without adding amateur treatments to the mix. Emma felt heat rise in her cheeks, but kept her voice steady. I administered thorn apple extract combined with hot steam therapy, hardly a folk remedy. It's a standard treatment for acute bronchospasm. Dr. Wallace's eyebrows rose slightly, perhaps surprised by her correct use of medical terminology. Nevertheless, medical care in Silverton falls under my purview. Mr. Hargrove has made it clear that all mine-related injuries and illnesses are to be treated exclusively by company physicians. Mr. O'Connor was at home, not in the mine, Emma pointed out. His wife sought help for a medical emergency. Would you have preferred I turned them away while they waited for your next scheduled visit? The doctor's mouth tightened, but before he could respond, the door opened again to admit Thomas Sullivan. He paused on the threshold, taking in the scene before him with a quick assessing glance. Dr. Wallace, didn't expect to see you here. Sullivan, the doctor nodded curtly. I came to speak with Miss Wilson about her interference in company medical matters. Thomas stepped fully into the room, his presence somehow making the space feel smaller. Saving a man's life is hardly interference. James O'Connor might not have survived the night without Miss Wilson's help. So I've heard, Dr. Wallace said dryly. Though I find it remarkable that a condition he's managed for years suddenly became life-threatening, just as a new healer arrived in town. Emma bristled at the implication. The progression of silicosis isn't linear, Doctor. Patients can be stable for months, then experience acute episodes that can indeed prove fatal without intervention. I'm sure your medical training covered this. Dr. Wallace's face flushed slightly at her pointed reminder of established medical facts. Be that as it may, Miss Wilson, I must insist that you refrain from treating miners or their families without proper consultation. These people don't understand the complexities of medical care. They may choose your convenient proximity over proper treatment to their detriment. Or perhaps, Thomas interjected quietly, they choose care they can actually access and afford, rather than treatments that drive them deeper into debt to the company store. The doctor's expression hardened. The company provides medical care as a service to its employees, Sullivan. If miners cannot afford that care, perhaps they should manage their wages more responsibly. Emma saw Thomas's jaw tighten, his hands closing into fists at his sides. She stepped forward, drawing Dr. Wallace's attention back to her before Thomas could respond with what she suspected might damage his position at the mine. Doctor, I have no intention of undermining your authority, she said diplomatically. My priority is the well-being of this community. If emergencies arise when you're not available, surely it's better that someone with knowledge provides care rather than no one at all. Dr. Wallace regarded her for a long moment, his expression calculating. Your point is noted, Miss Wilson. However, I expect to be informed of any treatments you administer, and I reserve the right to countermand them if I deem necessary." It wasn't quite acceptance, but it was a concession Emma hadn't expected. "That seems reasonable. Perhaps we could establish a system for sharing information about patients. My father found that collaborative approaches often benefited difficult cases." A flicker of something, perhaps reluctant professional curiosity, crossed the doctor's face. "Your father specialized in respiratory conditions." Among other things, he documented his treatments of dock workers and coal heavers extensively. "I have his journals, if you'd be interested in reviewing them." Dr. Wallace hesitated, professional interest warring with his obvious desire to dismiss her. Finally, he gave a short nod. "I might examine them, if time permits, during my next visit." He gathered his hat and bag, then fixed her with a stern look. "In the meantime, Miss Wilson, remember that there's a significant difference between assisting a qualified physician and practicing medicine. The former is commendable. The latter, without proper credentials, is irresponsible at best and dangerous at worst." With that parting admonition, he departed, brushing past Thomas with barely a nod of acknowledgement. Thomas exhaled slowly once the doctor had gone. "That was diplomatic of you." Emma smiled wryly. "Diplomatic is one word for it. Strategic might be another. Antagonizing the only official physician for miles would hardly serve the community's interests. Still, you stood your ground without creating an enemy. That's no small feat with Wallace. He has a reputation for dismissing anyone without formal credentials, including midwives who've delivered hundreds of babies safely." Emma moved to prepare the classroom for the day's lessons, straightening slates and checking chalk supplies. "Medical men are often protective of their territory. My father was unusual in his willingness to learn from those with practical experience rather than formal training." Thomas helped her arrange the tables, their movements falling into an easy rhythm, as if they had worked together for years rather than days. "How was O'Connor when you left him last night?" "Stabilized, but still in danger. The damage to his lungs is extensive and permanent. Each attack leaves him weaker, more vulnerable to the next." Emma paused, looking directly at Thomas. "How many miners suffer from similar conditions?" His expression grew somber. "More than half of those who've been working underground for 5 years or more. The older tunnels especially, poor ventilation, constant dust from blasting and drilling. Men breathe it for 10, 12 hours a day." "There must be ways to reduce exposure, water sprays to keep dust down, better ventilation systems." "There are," Thomas confirmed. "I've proposed them repeatedly." Hargrove claims the expense isn't justified given the natural turnover of workers. The coldness of the calculation, men's lives weighed against profit margins, left Emma momentarily speechless. When she found her voice again, it was quiet, with controlled anger. Natural turnover, as if men dying or becoming too ill to work is simply an expected part of the process, like replacing worn equipment. "That's exactly how Hargrove sees it," Thomas said grimly. "Men are just another resource to extract value from, as expendable as the mules that pull the ore carts." The door opened, admitting the first of Emma's students, Sophia Rossi and her older brother Marco, their faces bright with excitement for their second day of school. Emma pushed aside her anger, determined not to let it shadow the children's education. "Good morning," she greeted them warmly. "You're early again. Would you like to help me prepare for today's lessons?" As more children arrived, Thomas took his leave with a promise to check on the O'Connor family and report back. Emma threw herself into teaching, using the structure she had established the day before while adapting to what she had learned about each child's abilities and needs. The morning passed quickly, filled with reading lessons for the younger children, mathematics for the older ones, and geography for all. Emma had decided to make the world beyond Silverton a regular part of their education, believing that knowledge of other places and cultures would expand their horizons beyond the minds that dominated their community. During the midday break, while the children ate their modest lunches in the small yard behind the building, Emma prepared to visit James O'Connor. She had just gathered her medical bag when Joshua Palmer appeared at the classroom door, his expression troubled. Finally, he gave a short nod. I might examine them, if time permits, during my next visit. He gathered his hat and bag, then fixed her with a stern look. In the meantime, Miss Wilson, remember that there's a significant difference between assisting a qualified physician and practicing medicine. The former is commendable. The latter, without proper credentials, is irresponsible at best and dangerous at worst. With that parting admonition, he departed, brushing past Thomas with barely a nod of acknowledgement. Thomas exhaled slowly once the doctor had gone. That was diplomatic of you. Emma smiled wryly. Diplomatic is one word for it. Strategic might be another. Antagonizing the only official physician for miles would hardly serve the community's interests. Still, you stood your ground without creating an enemy. That's no small feat with Wallace. He has a reputation for dismissing anyone without formal credentials, including midwives who've delivered hundreds of babies safely. Emma moved to prepare the classroom for the day's lessons, straightening slates and checking chalk supplies. Medical men are often protective of their territory. My father was unusual in his willingness to learn from those with practical experience rather than formal training. Thomas helped her arrange the tables, their movements falling into an easy rhythm, as if they had worked together for years rather than days. How was O'Connor when you left him last night? Stabilized, but still in danger. The damage to his lungs is extensive and permanent. Each attack leaves him weaker, more vulnerable to the next. Emma paused, looking directly at Thomas. How many miners suffer from similar conditions? His expression grew somber. More than half of those who've been working underground for 5 years or more. The older tunnels especially, poor ventilation, constant dust from blasting and drilling. Men breathe it for 10, 12 hours a day. There must be ways to reduce exposure, water sprays to keep dust down, better ventilation systems. There are, Thomas confirmed. I've proposed them repeatedly. Hargrove claims the expense isn't justified given the natural turnover of workers. The coldness of the calculation, men's lives weighed against profit margins, left Emma momentarily speechless. When she found her voice again, it was quiet, with controlled anger. Natural turnover, as if men dying or becoming too ill to work is simply an expected part of the process, like replacing worn equipment. That's exactly how Hargrove sees it, Thomas said grimly. Men are just another resource to extract value from, as expendable as the mules that pull the ore carts. The door opened, admitting the first of Emma's students, Sophia Rossi and her older brother Marco, their faces bright with excitement for their second day of school. Emma pushed aside her anger, determined not to let it shadow the children's education. Good morning, she greeted them warmly. You're early again. Would you like to help me prepare for today's lessons? As more children arrived, Thomas took his leave with a promise to check on the O'Connor family and report back. Emma threw herself into teaching, using the structure she had established the day before while adapting to what she had learned about each child's abilities and needs. The morning passed quickly, filled with reading lessons for the younger children, mathematics for the older ones, and geography for all. Emma had decided to make the world beyond Silverton a regular part of their education, believing that knowledge of other places and cultures would expand their horizons beyond the minds that dominated their community. During the midday break, while the children ate their modest lunches in the small yard behind the building, Emma prepared to visit James O'Connor. She had just gathered her medical bag when Joshua Palmer appeared at the classroom door, his expression troubled. "Miss Wilson, I thought you should know. There's news about the mine that might affect your students." Emma set down her bag, instantly alert. "What's happened?" "Hargrove announced wage reductions this morning, 15% across all positions, effective immediately." Joshua's voice held the controlled anger of a journalist reporting an injustice he was powerless to change. He claims declining silver prices necessitate the cut. Emma thought of the families she had met, already struggling to feed their children, to keep roofs over their heads. A 15% reduction would push many beyond their ability to manage. How are the miners responding? Joshua ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration. "There's talk of a strike, but many are afraid. Winter's coming, and Hargrove owns most of the housing. Strike, and you might find yourself and your family homeless when the snow flies." "And Thomas, what does he advise?" "That's the other news. Sullivan's been called to a strategy meeting at Hargrove's office. Some fear he'll be forced to implement the cuts or lose his position." The thought of Thomas being made to choose between his principles and his livelihood sent a cold wave through Emma. She had seen enough of his character to know such a choice would tear him apart. "Thank you for telling me, Joshua. I should prepare the children for what they might face. At home tonight, their parents will be distressed." Joshua nodded grimly. "Ma sent this, said you might need extra for the little ones." He handed her a cloth-wrapped bundle that proved to contain a loaf of fresh bread and a small crock of preserves. "There'll be less food on tables tonight." After Joshua left, Emma modified her afternoon plans. The children would need reassurance, understanding, and perhaps most importantly, a sense that education offered a path beyond the cycles of exploitation their parents faced. She would emphasize practical skills even more. Mathematics that would help them verify calculations of wages and debts, reading that would allow them to understand contracts and agreements, writing that would give them voice to advocate for themselves. When the children returned from their break, Emma noticed their subdued demeanor. Word had already spread, passed from older siblings to younger ones, from one family to another in the close-knit mining community. "I understand there has been news from the mine today," she said gently, gathering them all close rather than separating them into their usual learning groups. "I know you may be worried about what this means for your families." 10-year-old Patrick O'Connor's face was tight with precocious concern. "Pa can't go back to work yet, and now they're cutting wages. Ma was crying when she brought our lunch." Emma knelt before him, meeting his eyes directly. "Your father needs to heal properly, Patrick. The Miners' Aid Society will help your family during this time." "But what if they can't?" a girl named Hannah asked, her voice small. "My Da says the aid fund is already low from helping 3 families after the tunnel collapse last month." The question hung in the air, giving voice to the precarious reality these children lived with every day, the knowledge that disaster was never more than a breath away in a mining town, that security was an illusion that could shatter with a single shift of earth or change in company policy. Emma took a deep breath, knowing these children deserved honesty rather than empty reassurances. "I don't have an easy answer, Hannah. What I can tell you is that communities survive hard times by supporting one another. Your families have welcomed me, helped me establish this school. Now we may need to find new ways to help each other through this challenge." She rose and moved to the blackboard, picking up a piece of chalk. "Miss Wilson, I thought you should know. There's news about the mine that might affect your students." Emma set down her bag, instantly alert. "What's happened?" "Hargrove announced wage reductions this morning, 15% across all positions, effective immediately." Joshua's voice held the controlled anger of a journalist reporting an injustice he was powerless to change. He claims declining silver prices necessitate the cut. Emma thought of the families she had met, already struggling to feed their children, to keep roofs over their heads. A 15% reduction would push many beyond their ability to manage. How are the miners responding? Joshua ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration. There's talk of a strike, but many are afraid. Winter's coming, and Hargrove owns most of the housing. Strike, and you might find yourself and your family homeless when the snow flies. And Thomas, what does he advise? That's the other news. Sullivan's been called to a strategy meeting at Hargrove's office. Some fear he'll be forced to implement the cuts or lose his position. The thought of Thomas being made to choose between his principles and his livelihood sent a cold wave through Emma. She had seen enough of his character to know such a choice would tear him apart. Thank you for telling me, Joshua. I should prepare the children for what they might face. At home tonight, their parents will be distressed. Joshua nodded grimly. Ma sent this, said you might need extra for the little ones. He handed her a cloth-wrapped bundle that proved to contain a loaf of fresh bread and a small crock of preserves. There'll be less food on tables tonight. After Joshua left, Emma modified her afternoon plans. The children would need reassurance, understanding, and perhaps most importantly, a sense that education offered a path beyond the cycles of exploitation their parents faced. She would emphasize practical skills even more. Mathematics that would help them verify calculations of wages and debts, reading that would allow them to understand contracts and agreements, writing that would give them voice to advocate for themselves. When the children returned from their break, Emma noticed their subdued demeanor. Word had already spread, passed from older siblings to younger ones, from one family to another in the close-knit mining community. I understand there has been news from the mine today, she said gently, gathering them all close rather than separating them into their usual learning groups. I know you may be worried about what this means for your families. 10-year-old Patrick O'Connor's face was tight with precocious concern. Pa can't go back to work yet, and now they're cutting wages. Ma was crying when she brought our lunch. Emma knelt before him, meeting his eyes directly. Your father needs to heal properly, Patrick. The Miners' Aid Society will help your family during this time. But what if they can't? A girl named Hannah asked, her voice small. My Da says the aid fund is already low from helping 3 families after the tunnel collapse last month. The question hung in the air, giving voice to the precarious reality these children lived with every day, the knowledge that disaster was never more than a breath away in a mining town, that security was an illusion that could shatter with a single shift of earth or change in company policy. Emma took a deep breath, knowing these children deserved honesty rather than empty reassurances. I don't have an easy answer, Hannah. What I can tell you is that communities survive hard times by supporting one another. Your families have welcomed me, helped me establish this school. Now we may need to find new ways to help each other through this challenge. She rose and moved to the blackboard, picking up a piece of chalk. This afternoon, we're going to learn something important. How to calculate household budgets, how to determine what is necessary and what might be reduced in difficult times. This is mathematics with immediate, practical application. The older children leaned forward with increased interest, while even the younger ones seemed to sense the relevance of this lesson to their family's well-being. Emma divided the board into columns: income, essential expenses, flexible expenses, and began a lesson that bridged mathematics, economics, and survival. By the time school ended for the day, Emma had established a framework for the children to help their parents analyze household needs, identify potential savings, and understand the real impact of the wage reduction. It wasn't a solution to the underlying injustice, but it was a tool to help navigate its immediate effects. As the children departed, many lingered to thank her, their young faces solemn with new understanding. Patrick O'Connor was the last to leave, hanging back until the others had gone. "Miss Wilson," he said hesitantly, "could you teach us more about the laws, about miners' rights and such? Pa says Mr. Sullivan talks about these things, but most men don't understand enough to know if what the company does is legal." The request revealed a sophistication of thought that impressed Emma. "That's an excellent suggestion, Patrick. Legal knowledge is indeed a form of power. I'll develop lessons on basic rights and contracts." The boy nodded seriously. "Thank you, Miss Wilson. Pa says knowledge is the only thing the bosses can't take away from us once we have it." After Patrick left, Emma gathered her medical supplies, determined to check on James O'Connor before returning to her evening planning. The news of wage reductions made her visit even more essential. The family would need to know exactly what care O'Connor required and what alternatives existed to the expensive powders prescribed by the company doctor. Outside, the afternoon had turned cool, clouds gathering over the western peaks with the promise of early snow. Emma pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and set off toward the miners' quarter, her mind busy with plans for both educational and medical interventions that might help the community weather this latest hardship. She had nearly reached the O'Connor cabin when she spotted Thomas walking rapidly in her direction, his expression grim. He slowed when he saw her, removing his hat in greeting. "Emma, I was coming to find you. Joshua told me about the wage reductions," she said. Without preamble, "and your meeting with Hargrove." Thomas's jaw tightened. News travels fast in Silverton. "What happened?" He glanced around, noting several miners watching them with undisguised interest from their porches. "Not here. Walk with me?" They fell into step together, heading toward the creek that ran along the edge of town, a place less likely to be overheard. Thomas remained silent until they reached the water's edge, where the rushing sound provided natural cover for their conversation. "Hargrove gave me an ultimatum," he said finally, his voice low but intense with controlled anger. "Implement the wage reductions without complaint, or be replaced with someone who will." Emma studied his face, noting the tension in every line. "What did you tell him?" "That I needed time to review the payroll schedules." His laugh held no humor, a delaying tactic at best. "He expects my answer by morning. If you refuse, I lose my position. Another foreman takes over, probably young Jenkins, who's been currying favor with Hargrove for months. The wage cuts happen regardless, and the miners lose their main advocate within the company." Thomas picked up a stone and hurled it into the rushing water. "If I agree, I keep my position but betray the men's trust. Either way, Hargrove wins." Emma heard the genuine anguish beneath his matter-of-fact assessment. Is there no third option? Could the miners organize, request arbitration? In theory. In practice, Hargrove would bring in replacement workers from Denver before allowing such a precedent. Many here have families, nowhere else to go. They can't risk it, especially with winter coming. He turned to face her directly. "The bitter truth is that the miners need me in that position. Even if it means implementing policies I find reprehensible, I can soften the blow, find ways to compensate the hardest-hit families, maintain safety standards that another foreman might ignore." The moral complexity of his position struck Emma forcefully. Thomas wasn't choosing between right and wrong, but between different forms of damage. Control in a fundamentally unjust system. "What will you do?" she asked softly. He ran a hand over his face, suddenly looking exhausted. "What I must. Accept the inevitable, but continue fighting the battles I can win. Ensure the ventilation improvements in the new tunnel aren't sacrificed to cost-cutting. Keep pressure on Hargrove about safety equipment. It's not enough, not nearly enough, but it's what's possible right now," Emma finished for him. "The children asked for lessons on legal rights today. Perhaps education is our long-term strategy, helping the next generation understand how to fight these battles more effectively." Thomas's expression softened slightly. You've been here less than a week, and already you're thinking in terms of our strategy. The observation startled Emma. She hadn't noticed her own shift in language, the unconscious claiming of Silverton's struggles as her own. Yet it felt right, this alignment with the community that had welcomed her despite the circumstances of her arrival. "I suppose I am," she acknowledged. "These children, their families, they've become important to me very quickly." Something shifted in Thomas's gaze, a warmth that had nothing to do with their discussion of mind politics. "You've become important to them too. The children talk of nothing but Miss Wilson and her lessons. The mothers gather at the well to discuss your medical advice. Even some of the men have mentioned how you helped O'Connor when no one else could." Emma felt a flush of pleasure at his words, at the implicit acceptance they represented. "How is James today? I was on my way to check on him when we met." "Better. Breathing easier, though still weak. Bridget says the medicine you left has helped considerably." Thomas hesitated, then added, "He asked for you specifically. Wanted to thank you himself." They began walking again, circling back toward the miners' quarter and the O'Connor cabin. The first fat snowflakes began to fall as they walked, melting as they touched the ground, but promising more to come. "Early snow," Thomas observed. "The old-timers will say it's an omen of a hard winter." "Is it?" "More likely just the usual weather pattern at this elevation, but miners are a superstitious lot. They'll see it as confirmation that lean times are ahead." The O'Connor cabin appeared ahead of them, smoke rising from its chimney in a thin, grey line against the darkening sky. Before they reached it, Thomas stopped, turning to face Emma directly. "Before we join the O'Connors, there's something I should tell you. Something I heard during my meeting with Hargrove." His expression had darkened again. Isabelle Montgomery was there. Emma remembered the elegant blonde woman who had appeared at the train station, claiming Richard Hargrove with such territorial certainty. His companion? Why would she attend a business meeting? "Her father owns the bank that holds the mine's mortgage. But that's not what concerns me." Thomas hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with what he needed to say. "She asked specifically about you, about your medical activities. She seemed determined to discredit you somehow." A chill that had nothing to do with the falling snow swept through Emma. "Discredit me? But why? I'm no threat to her." Thomas's expression was troubled. "I think, in her mind, you represent unfinished business. Hargrove rejected you publicly, chose her instead, yet you've remained in Silverton and carved out a place for yourself. You've gained respect from people whose opinions she claims to dismiss, but secretly craves." That seems... Emma searched for the right word. "Excessive. Surely she has more important concerns than a rejected mail-order bride teaching miners' children." "Perhaps. Or perhaps your refusal to be diminished by Hargrove's rejection challenges something fundamental in her worldview." Thomas's voice softened. "You were supposed to disappear, Emma. Return east in shame or fade into invisible spinsterhood. Instead, you've become essential to this community in ways Isabelle, for all her wealth and social position, has never managed." The assessment startled Emma with its insight into both her own journey and the complex social dynamics of Silverton. She had never considered that her simple determination to build a new life might be perceived as a challenge by someone in Isabelle's position. "What form might this discrediting take?" she asked practically. "I'm not certain. Rumors, perhaps. Questions about your medical qualifications, your moral character. Isabelle has considerable influence among Silverton's merchant class. She could make it difficult for you to obtain supplies, could pressure parents to withdraw their children from your school." Emma absorbed this unwelcome information, mentally cataloguing potential responses to various forms of attack. You for warning me. Forewarned is forearmed, as my father used to say. Thomas nodded, his expression serious. I thought you should know what might be coming, but Emma... He hesitated, then continued with quiet intensity. Don't underestimate your own strength in this community. In just days, you've earned genuine respect through your actions. That carries weight, even against Isabelle Montgomery's social influence. His confidence in her warmed Emma, despite the increasingly cold air and falling snow. We should check on James before this weather worsens, she said, practical concerns reasserting themselves. And you have a difficult decision to make before morning? Thomas grimaced at the reminder of his ultimatum from Hargrove. Yes, though I suspect we both know what choice I'll make, the only one that allows me to continue protecting the miners in the ways still available to me. Emma touched his arm briefly, a gesture of understanding and support. Sometimes the most moral choice isn't the most obvious one, Thomas. Sometimes it's the choice that allows you to do the most good within an imperfect system, even when that means compromising with forces you oppose. He looked down at her hand on his sleeve, then met her eyes with an expression of surprised gratitude. Most would simply tell me to stand on principle, regardless of consequences. And most haven't seen what I've seen, the real effects of poverty and illness on families like the O'Connors. Principles matter enormously, but so do practical realities. Emma withdrew her hand, suddenly self-conscious about the familiar gesture. My father used to say that the perfect solution can become the enemy of the possible good. Your father sounds like a wise man. He was. He would have liked you, I think. The simple statement hung between them, laden with implications neither was ready to address directly. Instead, Thomas gestured toward the O'Connor cabin, where light spilled from the windows into the gathering dusk. Shall we? The visit to the O'Connors proved both medically and emotionally necessary. James was indeed improving, his breathing easier, though still labored. Emma examined him thoroughly, pleased with his progress, but concerned about the long-term damage evident in his lungs. You'll need to stay above ground for at least 2 more weeks, she told him firmly. Preferably longer. Any return to Dusty. Conditions could trigger another attack, potentially worse than this one. Fear flickered across O'Connor's face. Miss Wilson, with these wage cuts coming, we can't manage without my pay for that long. Before Emma could respond, Thomas stepped forward. James, I'm arranging above-ground work for you when you're strong enough, checking equipment in the tool shed, maintaining lamps, lower pay than blasting, but safer for your lungs and better than no income at all. The relief on both O'Connor's and Bridget's faces was palpable. Emma realized this was the third way Thomas had found. Not defying Hargrove directly, but working within the system to mitigate harm where possible. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it might keep the O'Connor family fed and housed through the difficult months ahead. As they left the cabin, the snow was falling more heavily, accumulating on the ground in a thin white blanket that crunched beneath their boots. Thomas insisted on walking Emma back to her quarters, both of them huddled against the increasingly cold wind. You found a compromise for James, Emma observed as they walked. Not ideal, but practical. Thomas nodded, his breath visible in the frigid air. I've been seeking these small victories for years. They're never enough, but they're something. They matter enormously to families like the O'Connors. They reached the former assay office just as the snowfall intensified, the flakes swirling in the light, spilling from Emma's classroom windows. Thomas paused at the bottom of the exterior stairs that led to her living quarters. I should go. Early start tomorrow with the... He didn't finish, but Emma understood. Tomorrow he would implement the wage reductions, the task hanging heavy on his conscience despite its necessity. Thomas, she said impulsively, what you're doing, finding ways to help within a broken system, it takes more courage than simply walking away on principle. He looked up at her, snowflakes catching in his hair and on the shoulders of his coat. I wish I could believe that. Believe it, Emma said firmly. The miners need you in that position, using what influence you have to protect them. Another foreman might enforce Hargrove's policies without any of the mitigations you provide. Thomas was silent for a long moment, searching her face as if looking for something essential. Thank you, Emma, for understanding, for not judging. How could I judge when I'm making similar compromises? Working with Dr. Wallace despite his condescension, teaching children to function within an economic system I know is fundamentally unjust. Emma smiled wryly. We do what we can, where we are, with what we have. The understanding between them deepened in that moment, a recognition of shared values, similar struggles, parallel paths that had somehow converged in this remote mountain town. Emma felt a connection forming that went beyond their practical alliance for the community's benefit, beyond even the growing friendship of the past days. Thomas seemed about to speak when a voice called from the street behind them. Sullivan! There you are. A miner Emma didn't recognize approached, his expression urgent. Jenkins is gathering men at the saloon, talking strike despite the meeting you called for tomorrow. Things are getting heated. Thomas's posture immediately shifted, personal matters set aside as duty called. I'll be right there. He turned, back to Emma. I have to go. The timing is critical. If the men strike now without preparation or solidarity, Hargrove will crush them. Go, Emma said simply. Do what you can. He hesitated only a moment longer, then nodded and turned away. Following the miner into the snowy night, Emma watched until his figure disappeared into the swirling white, then climbed the stairs to her apartment, her mind filled with concerns for the community and her heart increasingly occupied with thoughts of Thomas Sullivan. Inside, she lit the lamp and stoked the stove against the growing chill, then moved to the window overlooking Silverton. The snow was falling more heavily now, transforming the rugged mining town into something softer, more ethereal. Lights glowed in windows. Across the valley, each representing a family facing uncertain times ahead. Emma thought of the children in her classroom, of James O'Connor fighting for breath, of Thomas walking into a saloon to prevent desperate men from making a potentially disastrous decision. She had come to Silverton expecting to find security as a mine owner's wife. Instead, she had found purpose in the very community Hargrove exploited, teaching their children, tending their illnesses, gradually becoming part of their struggle for dignity and justice. Richard Hargrove's rejection, which had seemed so devastating on that train platform, now appeared increasingly like a fortunate escape. Had he accepted her, she would have lived in comfort on the hill above town, isolated from the very people who now gave her life meaning. She would have been Mrs. Hargrove, perhaps respected for her position, but never for herself. As Emma prepared for bed, she found herself thinking of Thomas's face in the falling snow, of the weight he carried trying to protect the miners while operating within a system designed to exploit them. She thought of his quiet support of her teaching and medical work, his respect for her capabilities without question or condition. She had come west seeking a husband, it was true, but perhaps what she had really been seeking was something deeper. Purpose, community, and a chance to use the skills her father had nurtured. And perhaps, in the most unexpected way, she had found the possibility of love as well. Not the convenient arrangement she had anticipated with Richard Hargrove, but something built on shared values, mutual respect, and a common commitment to doing what was right, even when it wasn't easy. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing Silverton in white as the town faced an uncertain future. But within Emma's small apartment, a warm certainty was growing. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she was exactly where she was meant to be. The morning after the snowfall, Silverton awoke, transformed. A pristine blanket of white softened the harsh angles of the mining town, muffling sounds and lending an almost ethereal quality to the normally gritty surroundings. Emma stood on her small porch, watching as miners trudged toward the silver peak, their dark figures stark against the snow. Today they would learn of the wage reductions. Thomas would deliver the news he had fought against, but ultimately could not prevent. Emma wondered how he had fared at the saloon the previous night, whether he had managed to dissuade the more impulsive men from a premature strike that would only bring hardship. Her classroom would likely be somber today, the children carrying the weight of their parents' worries. Emma resolved to make the day's lessons especially engaging, a respite from the concerns that would dominate their homes. She had just turned to go inside when she spotted Joshua Palmer hurrying toward her, his face flushed with cold and excitement. "Miss Wilson, have you heard? There's been an accident at the mine." Emma's heart stuttered. "Thomas, is he—" "Sullivan's fine," Joshua assured her quickly. "It's the new tunnel. A section collapsed during the night shift. No one was seriously hurt, but Hargrove's furious. The support Sullivan designed prevented what could have been a catastrophe." Relief washed through Emma, followed by confusion. "But if the supports worked, why is Hargrove angry?" "Because Sullivan insisted on installing them against Hargrove's orders. Said he'd resign if the safety measures weren't implemented." Joshua's eyes gleamed with the journalist's appreciation for a significant story. The collapse proved Sullivan right. His supports held in the affected section, while the standard ones Hargrove approved for the rest of the tunnel would have certainly failed. So Thomas defied a direct order to install proper supports. Emma couldn't hide her admiration. Ordered them himself and had them installed during night shifts when Hargrove rarely visits. Used mine association funds plus his own savings. Joshua pulled out his notebook. "I'm writing a piece for the paper. Mine Foreman's defiance saves lives. Hargrove can't fire him now. Not when every miner knows Sullivan's stubbornness is the only reason they're alive." The news sent a complex mixture of emotions through Emma. Pride in Thomas's principled stand, worry about the repercussions he might still face, and a deeper feeling she wasn't quite ready to name. "What about the wage reductions?" she asked. Joshua's expression sobered. "Still happening, but there's talk that Sullivan convinced Hargrove to implement them gradually rather than all at once. It's not a victory, but it's something." Small victories within a broken system. Exactly what Thomas had described the night before. Finding ways to mitigate harm when fundamental change seemed impossible. "Thank you for telling me, Joshua. I should prepare for the children." As she had anticipated, the students arrived subdued, their young faces reflecting the tensions in their homes. Emma set aside her planned lessons and instead gathered them close, speaking frankly about the challenges facing their families and the community. "Times of hardship can also be times of growth," she told them, meeting each worried gaze. "Today we're going to learn about cooperation and mutual support, how communities throughout history have faced difficulties by working together." She led them through historical examples of mutual aid societies, cooperative ventures, and community-based solutions to economic hardship. The older children took notes with growing interest, while even the youngest seemed to grasp the essential concept that people supporting one another could withstand challenges no individual could face alone. By midday, the mood had lightened somewhat. Emma was just preparing to dismiss them for lunch when the classroom door opened, admitting Isabelle Montgomery, her expensive wool coat dusted with snow, her golden hair perfectly arranged beneath a fashionable hat. The children fell silent, staring at this unexpected visitor from the town's elite. Isabelle surveyed the classroom with a mixture of curiosity and disdain, her gaze finally settling on Emma. "Miss Wilson, how rustic your establishment is." Her voice carried the practiced charm of someone accustomed to having her every word. Attended to. Might I have a word with you in private? Emma maintained her composure, though inwardly she wondered what could possibly have brought Richard Hargrove's paramour to the miners' school. Children, please take your lunch break now. Return in 30 minutes. Once the last child had filed out, casting curious glances behind them, Emma turned to her visitor. "How may I help you, Miss Montgomery?" Isabelle removed her gloves with deliberate slowness, revealing fingers adorned with expensive rings. "I'll be direct, Miss Wilson. Your presence in Silverton has created a certain awkwardness." "Has it? I wasn't aware my teaching minors." "Children affected you in any way?" A flicker of annoyance crossed Isabelle's perfect features. "It's not your teaching that concerns me, but your relationship with Thomas Sullivan." Emma felt heat rise in her cheeks, but kept her expression neutral. "Mr. Sullivan has been kind enough to help establish the school and clinic. Our relationship is one of professional cooperation." "Is it?" Isabelle arched an elegant eyebrow. "The entire town has noticed his frequent visits, the way he looks at you. It's become quite the topic of conversation. Silverton must have little of substance to discuss if my friendship with Mr. Sullivan warrants such attention." Isabelle's smile hardened. "Friendship? An interesting choice of word for a woman in your position." "And what position would that be?" Emma asked, her patience wearing thin. A mail-order bride rejected by her intended husband, remaining in town under increasingly questionable circumstances. Isabelle moved closer, her voice dropping. "It creates a rather unfortunate impression, Miss Wilson. Some might wonder if you stayed in hopes of securing a different husband, having failed with your first prospect." The implication was as clear as it was insulting. Emma felt a surge of indignation, but controlled it, recognizing the attempt to provoke an emotional response. "My reasons for remaining in Silverton are my own, Miss Montgomery. But I assure you, they have nothing to do with seeking a husband, Mr. Sullivan or otherwise." "Perhaps not consciously," Isabelle conceded with false generosity. "But appearances matter in a town this size." She paused, studying Emma with calculated assessment. "I've come to offer you an opportunity, actually, a chance to establish yourself more appropriately." "I'm listening." "Richard, Mr. Hargrove, is establishing a proper school in town for the children of mine management and merchants. A teacher with your background would be suitable, and the position includes respectable accommodations. Far from this," she gestured dismissively, "makeshift arrangement." The offer took Emma by surprise, not just its substance, but its source. "Why would Mr. Hargrove offer me a position after rejecting me as unsuitable on the train platform?" Isabelle's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Let's be frank. Richard found you unsuitable as a wife for a man of his standing. That doesn't mean your educational background isn't adequate for teaching merchants' children." She smoothed her already immaculate skirt. "The salary would be considerably more than whatever these miners scraped together to pay you." Emma understood now. This wasn't an opportunity, but an attempt to remove her from the miners' community, to separate her from the people who had welcomed her, and most particularly from Thomas Sullivan. "The offer is unexpected," Emma said carefully, "but I must decline. I've made commitments to these families." Isabelle's expression hardened. "Consider carefully before refusing, Miss Wilson. Your current situation is precarious. One outbreak of illness blamed on your limited medical knowledge, one complaint about improper behavior, and you could find yourself unwelcome even in the miners' quarter." The threat was unmistakable. Emma straightened her spine, meeting Isabelle's gaze directly. "Are you suggesting you would manufacture such complaints, Miss Montgomery?" "I'm merely pointing out realities. A woman alone must be especially mindful of her reputation, particularly one in such unusual circumstances." Isabelle retrieved her gloves, pulling them on with deliberate precision. "The offer remains open until tomorrow. I suggest you reflect on it." After Isabelle departed, Emma stood motionless in the suddenly quiet classroom, processing the encounter. The threat had been veiled but real. Accept the position and leave the miners' community, or face a campaign to discredit her work and reputation. She was still standing there when Thomas arrived, snow dusting his shoulders and concern etched on his features. "Emma, is everything all right? I passed Isabelle Montgomery on my way here." She looked satisfied with herself. "She made me an offer," Emma said, relating the conversation in detail. "It seems she considers me a threat of some kind." Thomas's expression darkened. "Not to her relationship with Hargrove, to her self-image. You've earned genuine respect through your actions. She has only the deference people show to wealth and power. She threatened to undermine my position here if I refuse. Would you consider accepting? The salary would certainly be better, the conditions easier." Emma looked around the simple classroom with its rough-hewn furniture and handmade teaching materials. "No, these children need me. Their families have welcomed me without reservation. I won't abandon them for comfort or security." Relief visibly washed over Thomas's features. "I'm glad." He hesitated, then added, "Joshua told you about the tunnel collapse?" "He did. Your modified supports saved lives, Thomas." A shadow crossed his face, lives that shouldn't have been endangered in the first place. If Hargrove had approved proper supports throughout the tunnel, there would have been no collapse at all. But you did what you could with the authority you had. That's all any of us can do. Thomas stepped closer, his voice lowering despite the empty classroom. "Hargrove was livid, threatened to fire me on the spot. Then one of the miners spoke up, said every man would walk out if I was dismissed. Others joined in. For the first time, they stood together. Because you've earned their trust by putting their safety above your own position." "Perhaps." Thomas ran a hand through his hair, a gesture Emma had come to recognize as a sign of his discomfort with praise. "But it's created a complicated situation. Hargrove backed down temporarily, but he won't forget this challenge to his authority." Emma considered this, understanding the delicate balance of power that had shifted. "What will you do?" "Continue as before, finding ways to improve conditions within the constraints of my position. But something has changed, Emma. The men saw their collective power today, if only for a moment." His eyes held a cautious hope. "It's a beginning." The children began returning from their lunch break, their voices carrying through the open door. Emma and Thomas moved apart. Their private conversation necessarily concluded. "I should go," Thomas said. "There's much to do at the mine after the collapse. Will you come by this evening? I'd like to discuss establishing a food cooperative for the families affected by the wage reductions." His smile reached his eyes, warming them to the color of summer sky. "I'll be here." As Thomas departed and the children settled into their afternoon lessons, Emma felt a certainty growing within her, a conviction that despite Isabelle's threats, despite Hargrove's power, she had found her place in this community. 4 days ago, she had stepped off the train expecting to become Mrs. Richard Hargrove, a position that would have insulated her from the struggles of Silverton's working families. Instead, rejection had opened a door to something far more meaningful. Work that mattered, a community that valued her for her abilities rather than her status, and the possibility of a connection built on mutual respect and shared purpose. That evening, as promised, Thomas returned. Together they sat at a student's desk, mapping out plans for a community food store that would bypass the company's inflated prices. Their heads bent close over the paper, their hands occasionally brushing as they wrote and calculated. "This could work," Thomas said, reviewing their figures, "especially if we can arrange direct purchases from farmers in the valley." "The women could organize it," Emma suggested. "Many have experience managing household accounts with far too little money. They'd ensure nothing was wasted." Thomas looked up, studying her face in the lamplight. "You've accomplished so much in just a few days, Emma. The school, the medical care, now this cooperative plan. It's remarkable." "I had help," she reminded him. "From you, from Martha Palmer, from the miners' families. None of this would have been possible alone." "That's true of all meaningful work, I think. The mines couldn't function without cooperation either, though Hargrove prefers to ignore that reality." Their eyes met and held for a long moment, the understanding between them deepening. This wasn't just about practical plans for the community, though that remained their focus. It was about two people who had found in each other not just an ally, but a kindred spirit. Someone who saw the world similarly, who valued the same principles of justice and compassion. "Isabelle was right about one thing," Thomas said quietly. "People have noticed how often I come here." Emma felt warmth rise in her cheeks. "Does that concern you?" "No." His voice was firm. "But I wouldn't want to damage your standing in the community through careless disregard for proprieties. My standing depends on my work, not on gossip." Emma smiled slightly. "Besides, as you yourself pointed out, my reputation was compromised the moment I stepped off that train as Hargrove's rejected bride. I've chosen to build something new based on what I contribute, not on others' judgments." Thomas reached across the desk, his hand covering hers in a gesture both comforting and electric. "You're an extraordinary woman, Emma Wilson. And you're an exceptional man, Thomas Sullivan." The moment stretched between them, full of unspoken possibilities. Then Thomas smiled, squeezing her hand gently before returning to the cooperative plans. "Shall we continue? There's much work to be done." Emma nodded, her heart full. Richard Hargrove's rejection had led her not to despair, but to discovery of her own strength, of a community's resilience, and of a man whose quiet integrity matched her own. The path ahead would not be easy. Hargrove's power remained formidable, Isabelle's threats real. The miners and their families faced hardships that no single initiative could fully address. But for the first time since arriving in Silverton, Emma felt not just purpose, but possibility, the chance to build something lasting in this mountain town. Winter was coming, as the early snow reminded them, but spring would follow. And with it, perhaps, new growth not just for Silverton, but for the unexpected connection forming between a rejected mail-order bride and a mine foreman who had recognized in each other something worth cherishing. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.